The weirdest thing that ever happened at the office. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at the office started on a Monday morning, which was already doomed to be strange because Mondays have a way of bending reality just enough to feel off. The building was the same as always, a block of concrete and glass with revolving doors that trapped more than a few coats every winter, fluorescent lights that buzzed like lazy bees, and the faint smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room. People trudged in, clutching paper cups, half asleep, muttering greetings without making eye contact. I set down my bag, opened my laptop, and prepared myself for another 8 hours of emails and endless meetings. It should have been routine. But within the first hour, the weirdness began. It started with the printer. Everyone knows printers are cursed objects, prone to jamming at the worst possible moment. But this morning, it was different. Instead of spitting out spreadsheets or memos, it started printing haikus, perfectly formatted 575 syllables about everything from pigeons on the windowsill to the loneliness of office chairs. People gathered around, bemused, as sheet after sheet came out, each poem stranger than the last. No one admitted to writing them, and when IT arrived, they swore the printer wasn't connected to anything but the company network. Still, the haikus kept coming until the paper tray was empty. We laughed, we saved the best ones on the corkboard, and we thought that was the end of it. But the day had only just begun. Around mid-morning, a commotion erupted in the lobby. I wandered down to investigate and found a man in a full gorilla suit sitting calmly at the reception desk. He wasn't causing trouble, wasn't saying a word, just sitting there, typing slowly on the receptionist's keyboard while the actual receptionist stood nearby, shrugging helplessly. Security was called, but when they asked him to leave, he produced a visitor badge, perfectly legitimate, with the name Gary G. Gorilla printed on it. Nobody could explain how it had been approved. He sat there for 2 hours, occasionally nodding politely to employees passing by, then stood, bowed, and left without a word. We never saw him again. By lunchtime, the office felt like a carnival. People were buzzing about the haikus and the gorilla, laughter echoing down hallways where usually only sighs and keyboard clacks could be heard. But the strangest moment came later, during an all-hands meeting in the conference room. We were crammed in, sipping lukewarm water from paper cups, when suddenly the projector switched on by itself. Instead of slides about quarterly goals, the screen filled with a live feed of the rooftop. And on the rooftop stood a man juggling, not just juggling balls, but juggling staplers, stress toys, and at one point, a small office chair. Gasps filled the room. We rushed to the windows, craning our necks, and there he was, balancing on the ledge, tossing office supplies into the air with perfect precision. Security ran up, but by the time they reached the roof, he was gone, leaving behind only a pile of sticky notes arranged into the shape of a smiley face. The rest of the day was anticlimactic by comparison, but the energy in the office never returned to normal. People whispered in the hallways, speculating about secret prank clubs, performance artists, or ghosts with a flair for theatrics. HR sent out an email the next morning, reminding us to remain professional and not encourage disruptions, but no one could stop talking about it. The haikus were pinned up for weeks, the gorilla suit became a meme in our Slack channels, and the rooftop juggler was spoken of with a kind of reverence, as if he were a mythical figure. To this day, when I think about the weirdest thing that ever happened at the office, it isn't about a broken copier or an awkward meeting. It's about the day poetry came out of the printer, a gorilla typed at the receptionist's desk, and a man juggled staplers on the roof, turning an ordinary Monday into the strangest, funniest day in office history. The weirdest thing that ever happened in a hotel. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me in a hotel began on a long business trip when all I wanted was an uneventful night of sleep. I had checked into a mid-range place off the highway, the kind of hotel where the lobby smells faintly of coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, and the front desk clerk looks just a little too tired to smile. I was given a keycard, room 422, and trudged down the hallway with my suitcase dragging behind me. The hallway was quiet except for the hum of vending machines, the patterned carpet slightly worn from thousands of feet before mine. When I opened the door to my room, it seemed perfectly ordinary. 2 queen beds, beige wallpaper, a TV bolted to the dresser, and a lamp that flickered slightly when I turned it on. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed, relieved to finally rest. It started with the television. About 20 minutes after I'd turned it off, the screen blinked back on by itself. Static filled the room, white noise crackling, faint shadows flickering across the screen. I sat up, groaned, and switched it off again. 10 minutes later, it turned itself on once more. Annoyed, I unplugged it entirely, certain that would solve the problem. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard laughter. Not the muffled sound of guests in other rooms, not the kind of distant noise you can explain away, but clear, sharp laughter inside the room. It was high-pitched, childlike, but thin and echoing as though it came from somewhere far away and close at the same time. I shot upright, every hair on my body standing on end. The room was empty. The air conditioner hummed steadily. I told myself I was overtired, maybe imagining things, but when I lay back down, I heard the sound again, a giggle. Light, quick, playful. I turned on every light in the room, checked the closet, checked the bathroom, even crouched to look under the bed. Nothing. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew I was waking to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps across the carpet coming closer to my bed. My chest tightened and I held my breath, eyes straining in the dim light. The sound stopped right beside me. Heart pounding, I forced myself to reach for the lamp and flicked it on. The room was empty. The footsteps were gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart racing, too scared to move. Eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. Morning light made everything feel foolish. The room looked completely normal, the beige wallpaper almost cheerful in the sun. I laughed nervously at myself, convinced it had all been a dream. But when I opened the door to leave for breakfast, I froze. Sitting just outside my door, neatly placed on the carpet, was a child's toy, a small, faded teddy bear with one eye missing. My stomach dropped. I picked it up cautiously, half expecting something to happen, but it was just a bear, worn from years of handling. I set it on the dresser, left the room, and went straight to the front desk. I tried to sound casual as I explained the television problem, leaving out the laughter and footsteps. The clerk nodded knowingly and said, you were in 492. That room gets complaints sometimes. I asked what he meant, but he just shrugged. It's an old building. Things creak. TVs glitch. He smiled weakly, but I could see something in his eyes, something that told me he knew more than he was saying. I left the hotel that morning, feeling unsettled, more tired than when I had arrived. I've stayed in dozens of hotels since then, but none have left me with the same unease. Whenever I see a teddy bear in a gift shop, whenever I hear laughter echo in an empty hallway, I think of room 422. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me in a hotel wasn't bad service, or noisy neighbors, or a broken elevator. It was the sound of footsteps in an empty room, the laughter of a child I never saw, and a toy left outside my door, like a message I'll never understand. The weirdest thing that ever happened at the movies. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at the movies began on a rainy Saturday evening. The kind of evening where all you want is popcorn, a big screen, and a couple of hours of escape from reality. The theater was packed. everyone shaking umbrellas at the entrance, the smell of butter and nachos filling the lobby. I bought my ticket, grabbed a soda far too big for one person, and found my seat in the middle row. The previews rolled, the lights dimmed, and for the first half of the movie everything was normal. People munched quietly, a few whispers here and there, nothing unusual. Then about 20 minutes in, the screen flickered. At first we thought it was a technical glitch, but then the image froze and the lights came up halfway. Confused murmurs filled the room. Suddenly, from the side door, a man in a full tuxedo marched in carrying a violin. Without a word, he walked straight down the aisle, stood in front of the screen and began playing. The music was haunting and beautiful, echoing through the theatre as though this had been planned all along. People were stunned into silence. He played for 3 full minutes, finished with a dramatic flourish, bowed deeply and walked back out the way he came. The screen flickered again, the movie resumed, as if nothing had happened. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, but that wasn't the end of the weirdness. Half an hour later, during a tense scene, a balloon floated down from the ceiling. Just one, bright red, drifting slowly over the audience. People giggled nervously, some pointing, others ducking like it might pop. It hovered for a while before someone grabbed it, held it aloft, and the theatre cheered. A few minutes later, another balloon appeared, then another, until dozens of red balloons were bouncing across the crowd. Nobody knew where they were coming from, and the staff didn't intervene. Instead of ruining the film, it somehow made it more thrilling, like the movie had spilled out into real life. The final act came right at the climax of the movie. The villain was monologuing, tension thick in the air, when the screen flickered again. For a heartbeat, we thought the tuxedo violinist would return, but instead the projector cut out entirely, plunging the theatre into darkness. Groans filled the room. Then a spotlight hit. On the side aisle stood a man in a giant hot dog costume. He waved, the crowd screamed, and he began tossing wrapped hot dogs into the audience. People caught them like prizes, laughing hysterically. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he vanished back through the side door. The lights dimmed again. The movie resumed right at the same moment it had left off, as if nothing had happened. By the time the credits rolled, the entire audience was buzzing, strangers talking to one another, swapping hot dogs and balloon stories. In the lobby, nobody was talking about the movie itself. They were all talking about the violinist, the balloons, the hot dog man. The staff at the counter shrugged when people asked about it, saying they had no idea who those people were. To this day, I don't know if it was an elaborate prank, a secret art performance, or just a series of coincidences, but the weirdest thing that ever happened to me at the movies wasn't a technical failure or someone's phone ringing in the middle of a scene. It was watching a film interrupted by live music, a rain of balloons, and a man in a hot dog suit feeding an entire theatre, turning a night at the cinema into a story I'll be telling for the rest of my life. What's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to you at 3 a.m.? It's always 3 a.m. when the world decides to get strange, isn't it? There's something about that hour when the streets are empty and the clocks tick a little louder, when the night feels like it's holding its breath, waiting to see who's awake to witness the weirdness. I've had my share of odd midnight moments, but the weirdest one, the one that still makes me shake my head when I remember it, happened years ago in the little apartment I used to rent above a bakery. The bakery smelled like heaven at 6 in the morning, but at 3, when the ovens were just firing up, the smell wasn't comforting. It was eerie, like ghosts were baking bread. I had fallen asleep on the couch that night, half watching some rerun on TV, when a noise yanked me awake. It wasn't the usual creak of pipes or distant car alarm. It was a knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. at 3 in the morning. Now there are rules for knocks at 3 a.m., and the first rule is don't answer. Everyone knows that. But I was younger then, reckless enough to think maybe it was important. I shuffled to the door, heart thudding, peered through the peephole. No one there, just the dim hallway light flickering like it was nervous too. I waited, hand hovering over the lock. Nothing. I almost walked away, but then came the second sound, not a knock this time, but singing, faint, off-key singing. I pressed my ear to the door and heard a voice, high and wobbly, mumbling the words to Happy Birthday. Now let me tell you, there are few things more unsettling than hearing Happy Birthday whispered outside your apartment at 3 a.m. when it isn't your birthday. I backed away slowly, muttering to myself, deciding I was either dreaming or about to become the opening scene of a horror movie. The singing stopped. Silence pressed in. I sat on the couch again, wide awake, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just some drunk neighbor. And then came the scratching. Soft at first, like fingernails on wood, scratch, scratch, right at the base of the door. I leapt up, adrenaline spiking, grabbed the nearest thing I could find for defense, which, unfortunately, was a baguette I'd bought from the bakery downstairs. There I was, brandishing bread like a sword, whispering pep talks to myself, when suddenly the scratching stopped. And then, clear as day, a meow. I froze. A cat? At my door at 3 a.m., I slowly cracked it open, ready to swing the baguette if needed. And there, sitting patiently, was a little black cat with a collar and no tag, just sitting, staring at me like I had taken too long to answer. I blinked. The cat blinked back. I laughed nervously, muttered, "So you're the birthday singer?" The cat yawned. Without asking permission, it marched past me into the apartment, tail high, as though it had lived there forever. I didn't own a cat. I didn't even particularly like cats at the time. But suddenly, I had one. He hopped onto the couch, curled into a ball, and fell asleep instantly, as if he hadn't just scared 5 years off my life. I stared at him, baguette still in hand, wondering what kind of cosmic mistake had landed me with a stranger's midnight cat. I figured I'd keep him for the night and find the owner in the morning, but at exactly 3:33 a.m. I woke again, not from a sound this time, but from the weight. The cat was no longer on the couch. He was on my chest, staring directly into my eyes, purring so loudly it vibrated through my ribs. I whispered, "Okay, buddy, personal space." But he didn't move. He just stared, unblinking, until I swore I could hear words hiding inside his purr. Maybe it was just the sleep deprivation. Maybe it was the adrenaline still fizzing in my blood. But I would have bet money the cat was trying to tell me something. Morning finally came, sunlight spilling across the floor like a rescue. The cat stretched, leapt down, and walked calmly to the door, waiting to be let out. I opened it, and he trotted off down the hallway without a glance back, as if our strange little rendezvous had been nothing but a scheduled appointment. I never saw him again. No signs on the building about a lost pet, no neighbors admitting to owning a black cat. He just vanished back into the city. And that, I thought, was the end of the weirdest night of my life. But a week later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a mug, plain white, except for one line printed across it in bold letters, "Happy Birthday." It wasn't my birthday. I still don't know who sent it, or if it had anything to do with the cat, or the knocking, or the eerie birthday song outside my door at 3 in the morning. Maybe it was just a bizarre coincidence. Maybe it was some kind of prank, or maybe that cat, wherever he was, had a sense of humor. All I know is that to this day, whenever I wake at 3 a.m. and the world feels too quiet, I half expect to hear singing outside my door, and I make sure the baguette is within reach. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a wedding. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a wedding began on one of those picture-perfect days, the kind of day where the sun is shining without being too hot, the sky is clear and blue, and the breeze is just strong enough to rustle the flowers tied to the chairs without knocking them over. It was my cousin's wedding, and the whole family had gathered at a countryside venue that looked like something out of a magazine, with rolling fields, white tents, and fairy lights strung everywhere. Guests were dressed to the nines, the bridesmaids were already posing for photos in their matching pastel dresses, and everyone was buzzing with excitement. I took my seat, chatting idly with relatives I hadn't seen in years, expecting the usual flow of events: vows, rings, applause, champagne. Nothing hinted at the chaos to come. The ceremony began beautifully. The bride appeared, radiant in her gown, the groom beamed with nervous joy, and the tea officiant began speaking with the practiced rhythm of someone who had married dozens of couples before. We were all leaning in, caught up in the moment, when the first disruption occurred. From somewhere beyond the hedge, there came a loud braying sound. At first, people giggled softly, assuming it was a farm animal in the distance, but then the hedge rustled, and to everyone's astonishment, a donkey wandered right into the aisle. Not a decoration, not a planned surprise, just a random donkey, tail swishing, hooves clopping on the grass. The bride gasped, the groom stammered, the guests burst into laughter. The donkey stopped halfway down the aisle, looked around as if confused, and then calmly began eating the floral arrangements. As ushers tried to shoo it away, the donkey brayed again, louder this time, startling a child who screamed, setting off a chain reaction of laughter, squeals, and chaos. The bride covered her face with her bouquet, shaking with laughter, while the groom bent over, nearly doubled up. The officiant attempted to continue, but nobody was listening anymore. And then, as though summoned by fate, the donkey's friend appeared, a goat, trotting in confidently as though it too had been invited. The goat headed straight for the cake table, nosing at the carefully decorated tiers that had been set out early. Guests rushed to protect the cake, waiters scrambled, the band stopped playing. What had been a serene countryside wedding had turned into barnyard bedlam. Eventually the animals were coaxed away by a group of determined uncles wielding bread rolls, and the ceremony resumed, though the mood was irreversibly altered. The bride and groom exchanged vows through fits of giggles, and when they kissed, the crowd cheered louder than I've ever heard at a wedding, as though we'd all survived some grand adventure together. By the time the reception began, the story of the donkey and the goat had already become legend, retold at every table, embroidered with each retelling, until it sounded like a fairy tale. The night went on with dancing, music, and endless laughter, but nothing came close to topping the sight of the bride, standing in her white dress, clutching her flowers, while a donkey chewed on the arch behind her. To this day, whenever anyone in my family talks about weddings, they don't remember the menu, the speeches, or even the first dance. They remember the animals. They remember how an ordinary vow exchange turned into the funniest, most unforgettable ceremony of our lives. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a wedding wasn't a dramatic objection or a wardrobe malfunction. It was a donkey and a goat who crashed the party and stole the spotlight, reminding us all that the best memories are the ones you never see coming. The craziest thing that ever happened to me at 3 a.m. 3 in the morning is the hour when logic goes to bed and nonsense takes its place, when the world outside is silent, but somehow everything feels louder when your brain whispers, "What if something weird happened right now?" And then, inevitably, it does. One of the strangest nights of my life began exactly then, at 3:04 a.m. by the glowing digits of my alarm clock. I had woken up thirsty, dragged myself into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. That was when I noticed it, light flickering outside my apartment window. Not headlights, not the steady beam of a street lamp, but a pulsing glow, faint blue like a nightclub had relocated to the parking lot. Against all better judgment, I pressed my face to the glass, and there, in the middle of the lot, was a man standing absolutely still, holding a shopping cart. He wasn't pushing it, wasn't filling it, just holding it. Both hands on the handle, staring straight ahead as if the cart were a loyal steed. I froze. My neighborhood wasn't known for midnight performances, and I began constructing wild explanations in my head. Sleepwalking, performance art, ghost of a former Walmart employee? I couldn't decide. I considered ignoring it, going back to bed, but curiosity had its claws in me. I opened the window a crack, and that's when I heard it. The man was humming. Not a creepy tune, not a lullaby, but the unmistakable theme song of SpongeBob SquarePants hummed slowly, reverently, as though it were sacred. I whispered, "What on earth?" But of course, he didn't hear. Just then the cart moved, not pushed, pulled. From the shadows emerged a raccoon, gripping the bottom rack with tiny paws, tugging like a stubborn toddler. The man didn't resist. He let the raccoon guide the cart across the lot, humming SpongeBob all the while, until they vanished behind the dumpster. I blinked, stared at my water glass. For a second I wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But when I went down the next morning, there was the cart parked neatly by the dumpster like someone had clocked out for the night. No one believed me, of course. My friends laughed, my neighbors shrugged. But every time I wake at 3 a.m. now, I peek outside, just in case. Because you never know when the humming man and his raccoon accomplice might return, pushing their midnight chariot under the flickering light, reminding me that the world is far stranger and far funnier than daylight ever admits. The time I went to the wrong place by accident. There are certain mistakes you expect to make in life, the kind you can see coming from a mile away. Forgetting your wallet at the grocery store, sending an email to the wrong coworker, maybe even leaving the stove on for just a little too long. But then there are the mistakes you don't prepare for, the ones that slide right into your day like a banana peel waiting for your foot. For me, one of those mistakes came in the form of an address, a very small difference in words, Maple Street versus Maple Avenue, and that tiny difference gave me one of the strangest nights of my life. The invitation had been clear, or at least I thought it had. My friend Julie was turning 29 and she wanted a low-key party at her place. Nothing too fancy, just food, some music, maybe a cake if someone remembered to bring one. She texted me the address, and I dutifully copied it into my Maps app, feeling very responsible. Usually I'm the type who shows up late because I get distracted or lost in thought, but this time I wanted to be on time, maybe even early. The kind of guest who brings chips and earns a gold star in the unspoken ranking of friends. I drove through the evening city streets, the kind of streets where porch lights glowed like little lighthouses and kids' bikes were still scattered across lawns from the day. The map led me neatly to 1420 Maple, and I parked, straightened my jacket, and grabbed the bag of chips I'd brought. Already I could hear music pulsing faintly from inside. Laughter. Voices. Perfect, I thought. Right on time. I knocked. The door swung open almost instantly, and a woman I didn't recognize grinned at me, eyes shining with the kind of friendliness only a party host can pull off. "You made it," she exclaimed, pulling me inside before I could even open my mouth. And just like that, I was swept into the living room, surrounded by people. The decorations were lovely, balloons tied to chairs, streamers curling across the ceiling, a big banner draped over the window that read, "Happy Birthday." The coffee table was covered in bowls of chips, dips, cheese cubes arranged like a tiny architectural marvel. Music thumped from a speaker, some pop playlist that kept everyone moving. I smiled, nodding, clutching my chips like they were proof of my identity. Here's the thing, I didn't recognize a single person, not one, but that didn't immediately set off alarms. Julie had a lot of friends, co-workers, people from her gym, neighbors. It wasn't strange that I might not know them all, so I did what any polite guest does. I smiled, I nodded, and I went with the flow. Someone handed me a drink, pink and fizzy in a plastic cup. Someone else draped a paper crown on my head and shouted, "Team birthday." I laughed nervously and raised my cup, telling myself, and this is fine, totally fine. "Go say hi to the birthday girl," a man urged, pointing toward the kitchen. So I went, weaving through the crowd, ready to see Julie and feel that sweet relief of recognition. But when I stepped into the kitchen, my heart froze. The woman in front of the cake, glowing with candles, was not Julie. She was a stranger turning 45, according to the glittery candles arranged on top of the cake. She spotted me and beamed. "You came!" she cried, wrapping me in a hug. I hugged back awkwardly, mumbling, "Happy birthday, we too," while my brain scrambled. Wrong person, wrong house, wrong party. But instead of confessing, instead of apologizing and fleeing, I just stayed. For the next 2 hours, I was no longer myself. I was whoever they thought I was. People asked questions that didn't make sense. "How's work been treating you?" "Are you still living with that guy?" And I gave vague, non-committal answers. "Busy but good," I'd say, or "Not anymore, thank God." And somehow that worked. They nodded, satisfied, and moved on. At one point, someone dragged me into a game of charades. I flailed my arms wildly, miming a roller coaster, and when someone guessed it correctly, the group erupted in cheers, clapping me on the back like I'd just scored the winning touchdown. I basked in the applause, all while thinking, these people have no idea I don't belong here. The food was incredible too. Platters of sliders, bowls of pasta salad, cupcakes with swirls of frosting so perfect they looked fake. I ate more than my share, guilt battling with delight. It was like breaking into a wedding feast, only I'd been invited by accident. Every so often I considered confessing. I'd open my mouth, about to say, "Funny story, I think I'm at the wrong party." But then someone would laugh or hand me another drink or pull me into a group photo. And I thought, well, maybe 5 more minutes. 5 minutes stretched into 10, into 20, into a full night of being an uninvited guest who no one questioned. The turning point came when the birthday cake was presented. Candles flickering, everyone singing off-key. I clapped along, smiled for the photos, and only when the number 45 burned brightly in wax did the truth slam into me. Julie wasn't 45, she was 29. I had crashed the wrong party. My phone buzzed in my pocket, messages from the real group of friends piling up. "Where are you? Cake's almost here." I excused myself, muttering something about the bathroom, and slipped out the door. No one noticed. No one stopped me. Outside, the night air hit me like a splash of water. I checked my phone again, and there it was, Julie's address, Maple Street, not Maple Avenue, 2 blocks away. I drove in silence, the bag of chips still unopened, in the passenger seat like a witness to my crime. When I reached Julie's house, the party was in full swing, but this time the faces were familiar. Friends from college, co-workers I recognized, laughter that made sense. Julie hugged me, asked why I was late, and I just smiled and said, "Long story." I never told her the full truth. To this day, she thinks I was just stuck in traffic. But sometimes I think about the other party, the one where strangers welcomed me like family, where I wore a paper crown and ate sliders and was cheered for guessing roller coaster. Somewhere out there, in someone else's birthday photos, I exist as a mystery guest, smiling in the background, holding a drink, pretending to belong. And maybe that's the strangest part, because for 2 hours I really did belong. No one questioned me, no one doubted me, and in a way I became part of their story as much as they became part of mine. The night I went to the wrong place by accident turned into one of the weirdest, funniest, most surreal memories I carry with me, a reminder that sometimes being lost takes you exactly where you didn't know you needed to be. The most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me at work. Everyone has at least one story they keep tucked away like a scar under a sleeve. A story so embarrassing that just thinking about it years later makes your stomach twist and your face heat up. For me, that story happened at work, in front of more people than I'd ever like to admit, and even though time has dulled the sting, the memory is still sharp enough to make me wince. It started innocently, as these things often do, on a Monday morning. The kind of morning when coffee feels like the only thing tethering you to the earth. I had been at this job for maybe 3 months, still new enough that I didn't know where the extra printer paper was kept, still nervous enough that I tried to laugh at all the boss's jokes, even the ones that landed with the grace of a lead balloon. That morning, we were scheduled for a big presentation. Not just any presentation, but one of those meetings where the higher-ups from corporate were visiting, where everyone wore their slightly too tight meeting jackets and carried clipboards to look competent. I wasn't even supposed to be presenting. I was just there to take notes, nod thoughtfully, and occasionally refill my coffee. But fate, cruel and theatrical, had other plans. About 10 minutes into the meeting, the projector sputtered. The IT guy wasn't there yet, and the boss started sweating. Without thinking, I said, "Oh, I can fix it!" as if I was some kind of technological wizard instead of someone who once broke a toaster by inserting Pop-Tarts the wrong way. Everyone turned to look at me. I walked up to the projector, fiddled with some buttons, and, to my eternal horror, instead of fixing the presentation slides, I managed to project my own laptop screen onto the massive wall. Now, if you're imagining neat little folders labeled Work and Projects, you are giving me far too much credit. What appeared on that 12-foot wide screen in crisp resolution was my desktop background, a meme of a raccoon holding a knife captioned "Soon." The room went quiet. Dead quiet. Every single executive stared at the enormous knife-wielding raccoon glowing above us like a warning from the universe. My boss coughed awkwardly. I fumbled to minimize the screen, but in my panic, I clicked the wrong button and opened my Spotify. The first song on my playlist blasted through the speakers, "I Will Survive" by Gloria Gaynor, loud and triumphant. The raccoon meme vanished, replaced by the lyrics scrolling dramatically across the screen. Executives blinked. Someone stifled a laugh. I nearly died on the spot, but fate wasn't done with me yet. As I scrambled to shut everything down, my email notifications popped up in the corner, huge and unavoidable. And right there, for all to see, was a subject line from my friend. "So, did you ever get over that guy who ghosted you?" Followed by the first line of the message, "He wasn't even cute TBH." The sound of muffled snickering filled the room. My ears burned so hot I thought I might spontaneously combust. Somehow, mercifully, the projector finally gave out completely, sparing me further humiliation. The IT guy arrived minutes later, plugged in a cable, and had the real presentation running in seconds, but the damage was done. For the rest of the meeting, no one said a word about it, but I could feel the suppressed laughter hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. I sat in my chair, shrinking into myself, pretending to take notes, while my soul quietly packed its bags and left my body. Later that day, as people filed past my desk, a few of them gave me small smiles, the kind of smiles that say, "We will never forget this." My boss patted my shoulder awkwardly and muttered, "Nice raccoon," before walking away. That was it. No lecture, no scolding. Just those two words. Nice raccoon. For weeks afterward, I was the raccoon person. Someone taped a picture of a raccoon to my cubicle wall. Someone else left a plastic knife in my pen holder. At one happy hour, they toasted me as the protector of the office. And while I wanted to crawl under the carpet and never return, I had to admit it broke the ice. People remembered me. I was no longer the quiet new hire. I was the one who had accidentally introduced corporate executives to a knife-wielding raccoon and Gloria Gaynor. Over time, the story mellowed into legend. When new people joined, someone would inevitably say, "You've heard about the raccoon, right?" And they would point at me, and I would smile weakly, wave, and die a little inside. Eventually, I leaned into it, printing a tiny raccoon sticker on my coffee mug, wearing the joke like armor. Because once something like that happens, you can't escape it. You can only own it. And now, years later, I can almost laugh about it. Almost. Because every time I plug my laptop into a projector, every time I see that screen flicker to life, my pulse spikes, my palms sweat, and I whisper a silent prayer. Please, not the raccoon again. So, the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me at work wasn't tripping in the hallway or spilling coffee on important papers. No, it was far stranger and far more memorable. It was the day a raccoon with a knife and Gloria Gaynor's Anthem of Survival made their corporate debut, starring me, unwilling and unforgettable. And in the end, maybe that's not the worst thing. Because sure, I embarrassed myself in front of the higher-ups, but I also taught them something important. When the world hands you chaos, sometimes the only option is to laugh, survive, and carry on, raccoon memes and all. The craziest coincidence that ever happened to me. Life has a funny way of weaving threads together when you least expect it. Little patterns that make you pause and wonder if the universe is playing some elaborate game of connect the dots. Most of the time, coincidences are small, running into an old classmate at the grocery store, discovering your co-worker went to the same summer camp you did. But every so often, one comes along that makes your jaw drop, that makes you question just how random things really are. Mine happened on a train, at 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Wednesday, when I sat down across from a stranger who turned out not to be a stranger at all. I was traveling for work, taking the train instead of flying because the flights were expensive, and I liked the idea of watching the scenery blur past the window. I had a paperback book in my bag, some snacks and headphones, prepared to keep to myself for the next 4 hours. I found an empty seat, slid in, and started to settle. Across from me sat a man, maybe mid-30s, with the look of someone who'd been travelling longer than I had. He had a duffel bag at his feet, a notebook in his lap, and a tired but kind face. I gave him a polite nod, the kind you give to fellow travellers who you'll never see again. About half an hour in, the ticket inspector came by. I handed over my ticket. The man did too, and as he reached into his bag, a photograph fluttered out, landing on the floor between us. Instinctively, I picked it up to hand it back. But when my eyes flicked down, I froze. It was a photo of my mother smiling in her 20s, long before I was born. My voice caught. Where did you get this?" I stammered. The man blinked, confused, glanced at the photo, then back at me. It's my sister." I nearly dropped it. My mother, his sister. I sat there, stunned, gripping the photo like it might vanish if I blinked too hard. Slowly, hesitantly, we started to talk. He told me his name. I told him mine. And piece by piece, the puzzle fit together. He was my uncle, my mother's brother. The brother she hadn't spoken to in decades after a falling out no one ever explained to me in detail. I had never met him, never even seen a picture, but there he was, sitting across from me on a random train, notebook in hand, as if the universe had grown tired of keeping us apart. The conversation that followed felt surreal. He asked about my mother, his voice thick with emotions he tried to hide. I told him what I could, carefully, knowing I was stepping into family territory full of old wounds. He told me stories from their childhood, things I had never heard, how she used to climb trees barefoot, how she once dyed his hair, green as a prank, how they used to sit on the roof of their house at night and count stars. I laughed, I cried, I listened like I was hearing about a whole different version of the woman who raised me. For hours we talked, the train sped, on landscapes shifting outside, while inside we pieced together a family tapestry that had been torn too long. By the time we reached my stop, I felt like I had known him all my life. We exchanged numbers, hugged awkwardly, and promised to stay in touch. And for once, it wasn't just words. When I called my mother that night and told her who I'd met, the silence on the line was heavy. Then she whispered his name, so soft I almost didn't hear it. We didn't talk much after that, not at first, but a week later she called me again, asked for his number, and 2 months later they met for coffee. The reunion wasn't easy. Years of distance and hurt don't vanish overnight, but it was a start. To this day, I still think about that moment on the train, about how a photo slipping from a stranger's bag turned into a doorway I didn't even know was there. Out of all the trains, out of all the seats, out of all the times, I ended up across from the one person who could connect me to a missing piece of my family. And that's the craziest coincidence I've ever experienced. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just chance. It was something bigger, something that reminded me that the world is stranger and smaller than we think, and that sometimes, when the timing is right, the universe will sit you down across from exactly the person you need to meet. The weirdest thing I've ever seen happen at work. Work is supposed to be predictable. That's the whole point, isn't it? You show up, you sit at your desk, you answer emails, you attend meetings where everyone pretends to take notes, and then you go home and wonder where the day went. But every workplace has its moment of chaos, the kind of day where routine breaks down and something so bizarre happens that it becomes office folklore. For me, that moment happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of the most ordinary meeting you can imagine. A meeting that turned into something so strange we still laugh about it years later. Our office was one of those open-plan nightmares where the walls never quite touched the ceiling, so you could hear every cough, sneeze, and whispered conversation, whether you wanted to or not. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner, and the hum of the air conditioning was like white noise trying and failing to soothe us. That day we were gathered in the conference room for what was supposed to be a strategic alignment session, which is corporate language for sitting in chairs while the boss clicked through slides full of bullet points nobody would remember. I was already fighting to keep my eyes open when it began. A faint, scratching noise at first, like nails against cardboard. At first, I thought it was someone fidgeting with a pen, but then it grew louder. The boss kept talking, oblivious, waving his laser pointer at a graph that looked exactly like the last graph. Then the noise shifted, scratching, then thumping, then something like a muffled squeak. People started glancing at each other, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. The sound was coming from the ceiling. Before anyone could comment, a ceiling tile above the conference table bulged downward ominously, like something out of a horror movie. And then, with no warning, it gave way completely. Down came a raccoon, not a small one either. A big, fluffy raccoon, wide-eyed and furious at having its nap interrupted, tumbled right onto the middle of the conference table, scattering papers, pens, and coffee cups in every direction. For a moment the room froze in stunned silence. The raccoon stared at us, we stared at it. The boss, laser pointer still in hand, gaped like he'd just discovered a new species. Then chaos erupted, people screamed, chairs clattered backward, someone shouted, "It's rabid," even though it was clearly just confused. The raccoon, panicking, bolted across the table, knocking over the projector with a crash that sent the slides spinning into oblivion. I tried to stand, but tripped on my chair leg, sprawling onto the carpet just in time to see the raccoon leap from the table onto the snack cart by the door. Chips flew everywhere. Security was called, though what they thought they were going to do, I have no idea. The raccoon darted from corner to corner, employees scattering like bowling pins. At one point, it perched triumphantly on top of the whiteboard, hissing at anyone who dared come near. Someone suggested we just open the windows, but of course they didn't open, because this was a modern office designed for maximum despair. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, maintenance showed up with a net and a bucket. Yes, a bucket. Don't ask me how that was supposed to work. After a ridiculous chase that looked like something out of a slapstick comedy, they managed to corner the raccoon and coax it into the net. Applause broke out spontaneously as they carried it away, still glaring at us like we had ruined its day. The meeting was cancelled after that, of course. Nobody had the heart or the concentration to keep talking about quarterly metrics after surviving a raccoon attack. We all retreated to our desks, buzzing with disbelief, replaying the scene over and over. For weeks afterward, the raccoon became our unofficial mascot. Someone photoshopped its face onto the company logo. Another person made stickers that said, "Raccoon approved." Even the boss, who had been the most rattled of all, eventually laughed about it, telling new hires, "If you think this place is boring, just wait until wildlife drops in." To this day, whenever I hear scratching noises in a ceiling or see a raccoon rummaging in a trash can, I flash back to that conference room, the papers flying, the screams, the raccoon sitting smugly on the whiteboard as if it had taken over the meeting. And I realize that work, for all its monotony, always has the potential to surprise you. Sometimes with promotions, sometimes with firings, but if you're really lucky, sometimes with a raccoon falling from the ceiling at exactly the right moment to save you from another slide about strategic alignment. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at school. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at school didn't take place in a classroom or during a test or even in the middle of one of those chaotic lunch periods when everyone is shouting at once and the cafeteria smells like tater tots and mystery meat. No, the weirdest thing happened in the gym, of all places, on a rainy Thursday morning when the weather had forced everyone indoors for an assembly. Now, if you've ever been to a school assembly, you know how they go. Long speeches, some teacher trying to wrestle a microphone into cooperation, kids pretending to listen while secretly doodling or whispering. It was supposed to be boring. It was supposed to be predictable, but that day turned into something I still think about years later because it was as if the universe decided to toss a little absurdity into the monotony. The gym was packed, the bleachers groaning under the weight of hundreds of students. We sat in neat rows, fidgeting, yawning, staring at the clock. The principal was giving one of his famous lectures about responsibility, which meant he was talking in a slow, droning voice that made time stretch like taffy. I remember leaning back, trying not to fall asleep, when the sound began. At first, it was faint, almost like a bird chirping. I ignored it, convinced it was my imagination. But then it grew louder, chirping, squawking, flapping, and before anyone could process what was happening, a pigeon swooped down from the rafters, wings spread wide, cutting through the air like a fighter jet. The gym exploded into chaos. Students screamed. Teachers flailed. The principal froze mid-sentence, microphone dangling uselessly as his eyes tracked the bird weaving through the air. It wasn't just one pigeon either. Another burst out from somewhere near the scoreboard. Then another. Soon there were 3 pigeons circling the gym like they owned the place. You could hear their wings beating, a frantic whoosh-whoosh that echoed against the high walls. Some kids ducked under the bleachers, others stood on their seats, pointing and shrieking. The band teacher tried to wave them away with a clipboard which only made them dive lower, swooping dangerously close to his head. At one point, a pigeon landed dramatically on the basketball hoop, perching like it was about to deliver a speech of its own. And then, because pigeons are nothing if not unpredictable, one of them pooped directly onto the principal's shoulder. The gasp that went through the room was unlike anything I've ever heard. For a moment, the principal just stood there, stunned, bird droppings glistening under the fluorescent lights. Then he slowly lowered the microphone, muttered something about postponing until another time, and walked off the stage with the dignity of a man whose authority had been single-handedly demolished by wildlife. The assembly was officially over. Teachers tried to herd us back to class, but the damage was done. Students were buzzing, laughing, reliving every swoop and flap. It became the only topic of conversation for weeks. People even started naming the pigeons like they were celebrities. One kid insisted they had been sent as a sign, though a sign of what nobody could decide. The janitor spent the next few days trying to track down the pigeons, setting up traps and sealing gaps in the rafters. But the legend of the great gym pigeon incident lived on. Any time the principal tried to give another assembly, kids would start cooing softly under their breath, and the poor man would stiffen, glancing nervously upward as though expecting the pigeons to return at any moment. Looking back, it was such a small thing, just a few birds in the wrong place at the wrong time. But to us, sitting there on those hard wooden bleachers, it felt like the universe itself had intervened to remind us that life isn't always serious, that sometimes authority can be undone by feathers and timing. And even now, whenever I hear pigeons cooing outside, I can't help but smile, remembering the day school stopped for a flock of uninvited guests at 3 in the afternoon. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me in public. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me in public took place on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, the kind of day where the sky is overcast but not dramatic enough to rain, the kind of day where you run errands just to feel productive. I had gone downtown to return a library book and pick up groceries, simple, boring tasks that usually pass without incident. The streets were busy but not crowded, a comfortable hum of people and cars moving along. I stopped for coffee at a small shop on the corner, took my cup to go, and started walking back to the bus stop. That was when I noticed him. At first, he seemed like just another street performer, the kind you see strumming guitars or juggling on the sidewalk. But this man wasn't juggling balls or playing music. He was juggling bananas, not just 3 or 4 bananas, but at least 10, all flying through the air in a chaotic orbit. His concentration was intense, his arms a blur, and people had gathered around to watch. I slowed down, amused, and then things got stranger. A woman stepped out of the crowd, handed him another banana from her grocery bag, and without missing a beat, he tossed it into the rotation. The crowd gasped, applauded. He grinned, sweat shining on his forehead, and kept going. Another person handed him 2 more. In seconds, he had nearly 15 bananas flying through the air, a yellow blur spinning like a carnival ride. I should have walked away. I had a bus to catch, but I couldn't. Nobody could. We were spellbound. And then, as if, sensing he had us completely under his spell, he called out, "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves!" He clapped his hands mid-juggle, sent all the bananas flying higher than seemed physically possible, and caught every single one perfectly. The crowd erupted into cheers, but he wasn't done. He reached into his bag and pulled out a pineapple. Without hesitation, he tossed it into the mix. Bananas and pineapples soared together in a wild dance of fruit. The absurdity of it broke something inside me. I laughed so hard, coffee almost shot out of my nose. Just then, a busker across the street began playing dramatic violin music, as if providing a soundtrack to the madness. Strangers clapped in rhythm. Someone shouted, "Encore!" And the man, now juggling 15 bananas and one very determined pineapple, nodded solemnly like a maestro conducting a symphony. And then disaster struck. The pineapple slipped. It tumbled down, bounced off the pavement, and rolled directly toward me. Without thinking, I bent down and caught it. The crowd gasped, then cheered louder than before. The juggler pointed at me theatrically and shouted, "A hero is born!" Everyone turned to look, clapping for me, and I stood there holding a pineapple like some kind of champion, cheeks burning, wishing the ground would swallow me. The juggler bowed deeply, gathered his fruit, and disappeared into the crowd as suddenly as he'd arrived. People drifted away, still laughing, still buzzing with the joy of it. I was left standing on the sidewalk, holding a pineapple that wasn't mine, coffee cold in my other hand, wondering if I'd hallucinated the entire thing. Eventually, I left the pineapple on a bench, unsure what else to do, and caught my bus. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The bananas, the pineapple, the applause. The way a completely ordinary street corner turned into a stage where strangers became an audience, where I became part of a story I never signed up for. To this day, whenever I pass that corner, I half expect to see him again, juggling fruit and looking for another accidental hero. And whenever I see a pineapple at the grocery store, I can't help but smile, remembering the day I held one aloft in front of a cheering crowd, crowned not by choice but by sheer coincidence as the pineapple hero of downtown. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me while traveling. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me while traveling began on a trip that was supposed to be completely uneventful, just a short train ride across the country for a work conference. Nothing glamorous, nothing adventurous, just a few hours of sitting in a seat and watching the scenery blur past the window. I had packed light, just a backpack with a change of clothes, a book I probably wasn't going to read, and some snacks to avoid the overpriced dining car. The train station itself was buzzing with the usual mixture of weary commuters and excited tourists, dragging oversized suitcases, and I slipped into the crowd, boarding with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of public transport. I found my seat, settled in, and prepared for boredom. That's the thing about weird experiences. They never announce themselves. They sneak in when you least expect it, usually when you're yawning and scrolling on your phone. About an hour into the ride, the train jolted slightly as it always does, and a man sat down across from me. He looked ordinary at first glance, mid-40s, glasses, a little scruffy, the kind of person you wouldn't remember 5 minutes later. He gave me a polite nod. I returned it, and I thought nothing more. Until a photograph slipped out of his notebook. It fluttered to the floor, face down, and I leaned down automatically to hand it back. But when I turned it over, I froze, because staring back at me from that photo was my mother, younger, smiling in a way I had never seen in real life. My heart thudded against my ribs. The man noticed my expression, frowned, and said, "Oh, thanks, that's my sister." My voice caught in my throat. That's my mum." He blinked, studying me, then the photo, then me again. The train clattered along the tracks, oblivious to the fact that two strangers had just discovered they weren't strangers at all. He asked my name, I told him, and piece by piece we realized the impossible truth. He was my uncle, my mother's brother. The brother she hadn't spoken to in decades, the uncle I had never met because of some family falling out no one ever explained. The rest of the ride turned into something out of a movie. We talked non-stop, our voices low but urgent, like we were afraid the train would stop and break the spell. He told me stories about my mom as a kid, climbing trees barefoot, dyeing his hair green as a prank, sneaking cookies from the top shelf. He laughed as he remembered, and I sat there stunned, hearing about a whole side of her I never knew. In return, I told him about her life now, the way she still hummed while cooking, the way she loved old detective shows, the way she always insisted on keeping extra blankets in the house in case guests got cold. His eyes softened as he listened, as though he were piecing together a puzzle he thought he had lost forever. At one point, he pulled out more photos, faded snapshots of family gatherings long before my time. I saw my mother grinning with wild hair and flared jeans. I saw grandparents I barely remembered. I saw fragments of a past that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. By the time the train neared my stop, it felt like we had known each other for years instead of hours. We exchanged numbers, promised to keep in touch, hugged awkwardly in the cramped aisle. I stepped onto the platform dazed, clutching my backpack, wondering how a trip that was supposed to be ordinary had handed me a whole branch of family I never knew. That night, I called my mother, my voice shaking as I told her who I had met. There was a long silence on the other end, a silence so heavy I thought maybe I had made a mistake. Then she whispered his name, softly, like she hadn't spoken it aloud in decades. They didn't reunite immediately. Old wounds don't vanish overnight. But weeks later, she asked for his number, and months later they met for coffee. It wasn't a fairy tale reunion, not exactly, but it was real. They started with small talk, moved carefully around the past, and little by little began stitching together a relationship that had been torn apart years before, and all because a random train seat put me across from a man with a photo in his notebook. I've traveled many times since then, planes, buses, trains, cars, but nothing has ever come close to that trip, because travel is supposed to take you places you expect, a conference, a vacation, a weekend getaway. But sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on how you see it, travel drops you right into the middle of a story you didn't know you were part of. And now whenever I sit down in a train car and someone settles across from me, I wonder what secret they might be carrying, what photo might slip from their bag, what coincidence might change everything. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me while traveling wasn't getting lost, or missing a flight, or sitting next to a snorer for 4 hours. It was discovering family on a train, in the hum of wheels against rails, in the chance fall of a photograph, in the realization that the world is smaller, stranger, and kinder than we sometimes believe. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a party. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a party happened on a Saturday night when I was in college, the kind of night where the music is too loud, the floor is sticky with spilled drinks, and people are shouting over one another just to be heard. It was supposed to be a standard house party, nothing unusual, nothing more memorable than a few blurry photos and a mild headache in the morning. But sometimes parties take on a life of their own, and this one spiraled into a story that people were still telling long after we graduated. The house belonged to a guy named Mark, who was known for throwing the biggest parties on campus. His place was already infamous for a broken railing on the staircase, graffiti on the bathroom door, and a mysterious smell in the basement no one could identify. That night, the house was packed wall to wall, music pounding, lights flashing. I squeezed through the crowd, balancing a paper cup of something neon, and found a corner to stand in while I watched the chaos unfold. At first, it was the usual scene, people dancing badly, couples making out in doorways, someone spilling chips all over the carpet. But then the front door burst open, and in walked a man in a full chicken costume. Not a mask, not a funny hat, a full head-to-toe chicken suit with feathers, wings, and a giant yellow beak. He didn't say a word, just strutted into the middle of the living room, flapped his arms and started dancing. At first, people laughed. They thought it was a joke, some kind of prank. But the chicken was serious. He danced like his life depended on it, wings flapping, feet stomping, spinning in wild circles. The crowd formed around him, cheering, clapping, filming on their phones. The chicken became the star of the party. Then it got weirder, because as the chicken danced, more people in costumes started arriving. A cow, a giant banana, a man in a full astronaut suit. No one knew where they were coming from, but they slipped into the party one by one. Joining the dance floor like this had all been carefully choreographed. Soon the living room looked less like a house party and more like a bizarre parade. The cow mooed loudly every few minutes, the banana kept tripping over its peel, and the astronaut tried to drink through his helmet, spilling liquid all over the floor. The crowd was losing their minds, screaming with laughter, chanting for the chicken to keep going. Mark, the host, tried to regain control. He stood on the staircase shouting, "Who are these people?" But no one paid attention. The party had a new leader, and it was the chicken. At one point, the chicken climbed onto the coffee table, raised his wings, and the entire room quieted. He tapped the side of his beak like he was about to make a speech, then let out a loud, triumphant "Balk!" The crowd roared in approval, as if this nonsense had meaning. The chicken jumped down, the music surged louder, and the party went from normal to legendary. Hours passed. People danced until the floor shook. Photos were taken that would never make sense to anyone outside that room, and strangers hugged the chicken like he was an old friend. And then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the costumed strangers left. The chicken led the way, marching out the front door with the cow, the banana, and the astronaut trailing behind like loyal disciples. The door slammed shut. The music kept playing, but the energy shifted. Without the chicken, the party felt ordinary again, like the magic had walked out the door. The next morning, everyone was buzzing. Who were they? Where did they come from? Were they invited? Or did they just wander in from another party? Nobody knew. Mark swore he hadn't invited them. No one could identify them from the photos. They were never seen on campus again. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air, danced their way into our memories and vanished forever. To this day, whenever someone mentions that party, no one remembers the music or the drinks or even who kissed who. They remember the chicken. They remember the way the room erupted, the way we all became part of something ridiculous and unforgettable. And now, whenever I hear music thumping through a wall or see someone in a costume out of context, I half expect the chicken to return, flapping his wings, ready to lead another night into chaos. Because the weirdest thing that ever happened at a party wasn't a fight, or the cops showing up, or someone falling asleep in the bathtub. It was a chicken suit, a cow, a banana, and an astronaut. And the way they turned an ordinary Saturday night into legend. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a party. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a party happened on a Saturday night when I was in college. The kind of Saturday that wasn't supposed to be special, just another one of those evenings where you show up at a friend's house, half expecting to leave early because you've got assignments due, or because you're secretly more of a homebody than a party person. I remember the sky was clear, the air carried that sharp chill that makes your breath puff out in little clouds, and as I walked across campus toward the house, I could already hear the music pulsing faintly, the bass line bouncing between the buildings like the party was announcing itself to anyone within a 5-block radius. The house belonged to Mark, a guy known for throwing the biggest, messiest, and most unpredictable parties. His place was already legendary. People swore there was a stain on the basement floor that no one had ever identified, that the railing on the staircase had been broken since freshman year and was now considered a kind of rite of passage. and that once a raccoon had wandered into the kitchen and left with a slice of pizza. I didn't know if all of that was true, but I did know that if Mark was hosting, something strange was bound to happen. The living room was already crammed wall to wall with people when I arrived. Lights pulsed, drinks sloshed, the floor was sticky in places that made me question what exactly had been spilled there. I pushed through the crowd, balancing a cheap cup of soda spiked with something sweet and too strong, and tried to find a spot where I wouldn't get elbowed in the ribs by dancers. For the first half hour, everything was normal, or as normal as a college party can be. People danced badly but enthusiastically. Couples made out against the walls like they were auditioning for a music video. Someone spilled chips onto the rug and just kicked them under the couch. I found a group I vaguely knew and made small talk, nodding along as if I cared about classes or exams. It was forgettable, background noise, the kind of thing you forget by the next morning. And then the front door opened, and in walked a man dressed head to toe in a full chicken costume. Not just a little hat with feathers, not just a Halloween mask someone had recycled, but a full body suit with white feathers sticking out in every direction, giant yellow feet, and a massive foam beak that bounced slightly as he walked. The room went silent for a split second, everyone staring. Drinks paused halfway to mouths. The chicken didn't say a word. He just strutted into the center of the living room, flapped his wings dramatically, and began to dance. At first, the crowd laughed, cheering him on as if he were just another drunk guy pulling a prank. But the chicken was serious. He danced with wild energy, spinning, stomping, flapping. People formed a circle around him, clapping to the beat, chanting, "Chicken, chicken," as though he was some kind of folk hero. Phones came out, flashes went off, and the chicken danced harder, feeding on the attention. For a moment it felt like the entire party belonged to him. And then it escalated. 5 minutes later, the door opened again, and in walked a cow. Not a real one, of course, but another person in a full cow costume, complete with udders that jiggled when they moved. The cow joined the chicken on the dance floor without hesitation, mooing loudly as if announcing its arrival. The crowd screamed with delight. The chicken flapped, the cow mooed, and the living room turned into a barnyard rave. But it didn't stop there. A few minutes later, a giant banana entered, a full banana suit, bright yellow, slightly bent at the top. The banana stumbled onto the dance floor and slipped, which only made everyone laugh harder. Then came the astronaut, wearing a bulky space suit complete with a reflective visor and gloves so oversized they could barely hold a cup. By now the party was in full chaos. The chicken was the leader, climbing onto the coffee table and flapping his wings like he was conducting an orchestra. The cow and banana danced around him. The astronaut tried to moonwalk, but kept bumping into furniture, and the crowd lost its collective mind. People were screaming, chanting, throwing confetti made from torn-up napkins into the air. It was no longer Mark's party, it was the chicken's. Mark himself tried to regain control. He stood on the staircase, waving his arms, shouting, "Who are these people?" But nobody listened. The chicken let out a triumphant "Balk!" and the crowd roared, as if he had delivered the greatest speech of all time. The music surged louder, and the party transformed from ordinary chaos into pure legend. I remember standing there, half laughing, half bewildered, wondering if I had accidentally wandered into a surreal dream. The costumes were too elaborate to be random. Were they hired performers? Some kind of flash mob? No one ever admitted to inviting them. They didn't talk, didn't break character, didn't even remove their costumes to catch their breath. They just danced, led cheers, and owned the room. Hours passed like minutes. People who would normally leave early stayed, glued to the spectacle. Strangers hugged the chicken like he was an old friend. The cow mooed every time someone shouted, "Milk!" The banana slipped on purpose, playing the clown. The astronaut saluted random people, visor fogging up with sweat. Photos and videos were everywhere, but even when you watch them now, they don't capture the energy of that night. You had to be there, standing, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, screaming with laughter as a man in a chicken suit stole your sanity. And then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they left. The chicken raised his wings one final time, bowed deeply, and led his strange entourage out the front door. The cow followed, then the banana, then the astronaut. The door slammed shut. The music kept playing, but the magic drained instantly, like the air had gone out of a balloon. People looked at each other dazed, blinking in disbelief. The party carried on, but it wasn't the same. Without the chicken, we were just college kids in a messy living room again. The next morning, the entire campus buzzed with questions. Who were they? Where did they come from? Were they a theatre group pulling a prank? Were they part of another party that spilled over into ours? Nobody knew. Mark swore he hadn't invited them. No one recognized their voices, their walk, their body language. They vanished as quickly as they appeared. People combed through the photos, zooming in, trying to spot clues, but the costumes covered everything. They were mysteries in feathers and foam. Years have passed since that night, but if you mention the chicken party to anyone who was there, their face lights up instantly. They don't remember what music was playing or what drinks were served or who hooked up with who. They remember the chicken, they remember the cow, the banana, the astronaut. They remember the way the room shook with laughter, the way strangers became friends for a few hours, united by the absurdity. And whenever I hear someone talk about the best party they've ever been to, I always think about that night, about the way 4 people in costumes turned an ordinary Saturday into legend. And sometimes when I'm walking down a crowded street or sitting at a bar and I see someone wearing something odd, a silly hat, a mask for no reason, I wonder if it might be them, the chicken and his crew, waiting for their next moment to strike. Because the weirdest thing that ever happened at a party wasn't a fight, or the cops showing up, or even someone passing out in the bathroom. It was a chicken leading a barnyard of chaos, and the way the world felt lighter, stranger, and more magical because of it. The weirdest thing that ever happened on public transport. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on public transport began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where nothing is supposed to happen except yawning, scrolling on your phone, and trying not to make eye contact with anyone. The bus was late as usual. People were shuffling impatiently at the stop. The sky was grey with the kind of clouds that don't quite commit to raining, and I had resigned myself to the boredom of another commute. When the bus finally arrived, squeaking to a stop with that tired sigh buses always seem to have, everyone piled in, shoving for seats, as if this ride were the difference between life and death. I found a spot halfway back next to the window and settled in with my headphones. At first, it was normal, the usual cast of characters, an elderly man with a folded newspaper, a teenager already asleep with his hood pulled over his face, a mother wrangling a child who insisted on pressing every button in reach. But then the atmosphere shifted when a man boarded carrying a giant cardboard box. It was taped haphazardly, bulging at the sides, and he held it like it contained something alive. He shuffled to the middle of the bus, muttering to himself, and set the box down carefully on the seat beside him. At first, no one cared. People glanced at him, shrugged, and went back to staring at their phones. But then the box moved, just a little at first, a subtle wiggle. The man patted it quickly, whispering something under his breath. People noticed. Eyes darted, whispers spread. The box wiggled again, harder this time, like something inside was trying to get out. The mother pulled her child closer, the old man lowered his paper, and I pressed pause on my music. Finally, the inevitable happened. The tape peeled back, the flap popped open, and out shot a rooster. A full-sized, flapping, squawking rooster, wings flailing as it leapt onto the aisle. The bus erupted. People screamed, scrambled out of their seats, clutching bags and coats as if the bird were armed. The rooster strutted proudly down the aisle, crowing loudly, its voice echoing off the metal walls like a war cry. The man jumped up, chasing after it, shouting, "Come back, Henry!" as if that clarified anything. Henry the rooster darted between legs, hopped onto empty seats, knocked over someone's coffee, and crowed again with the authority of a king reclaiming his throne. The bus driver slammed the brakes, pulled over, and shouted, "What the hell is going on back there?" as though he couldn't already hear the chaos. The rooster, undeterred, flapped onto the driver's dashboard, perched next to the steering wheel, and let out the loudest crow yet. The entire bus dissolved into hysterics. Some people screamed, others laughed until tears streamed down their faces. The child who had been pressing buttons was delighted, clapping and shouting, "Chicken, chicken!" The old man with the newspaper muttered, "This is why I walk," though he made no move to get off. The driver demanded the man control his bird, but Henry had other plans. He strutted to the back of the bus, pecked at someone's shoelaces, then hopped onto the luggage rack above the seats like he owned it. The man climbed onto the seats, reaching desperately, muttering apologies, but Henry just danced out of reach, feathers drifting down like confetti. People pulled out their phones, recording every second, narrating breathlessly for whoever would watch later online. One woman near me leaned over and whispered, "This is better than Netflix." Eventually, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the man managed to grab Henry mid-flap. The rooster squawked indignantly, wings beating furiously, but the man shoved him gently back into the box, retaping it as best he could while muttering soothing words. The bus driver shook his head, muttered something about rules against livestock, but somehow decided to keep driving. Everyone returned to their seats, buzzing with disbelief, replaying the scene over and over. I sat by the window, still in shock, half expecting the rooster to break free again. When I got off at my stop, the bus was still alive with chatter, strangers bonding over the absurdity they had just witnessed. I walked away laughing, still hearing the rooster's triumphant crow echoing in my ears. And the thing is, whenever people talk about weird public transport stories, about delays, odd smells, or loud phone calls, I always win, because nothing beats the day a rooster named Henry took control of the morning commute, turned a bus into his personal stage, and reminded us all that sometimes the strangest moments come when you're just trying to get from point A to point B. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a wedding. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a wedding happened on one of those deceptively perfect afternoons where the sky is blue without a single cloud in sight. The flowers look like they've been arranged by angels, and the whole world seems determined to convince you that nothing could possibly go wrong. I had been invited to a friend's cousin's wedding, which meant I barely knew anyone there, and to be honest, I went more for the free food and open bar than the heartfelt vows. The venue was a charming little countryside estate, complete with a white gazebo, twinkling fairy lights strung from tree to tree, and chairs lined in neat rows facing a floral arch where the ceremony was set to take place. Guests were already milling around when I arrived, everyone dressed in their finest, sunglasses gleaming, the air buzzing with polite laughter. It felt like the kind of wedding that would go off without a hitch, the kind of wedding where nothing memorable ever really happens, except for maybe the best man getting too drunk during the toast. But the universe loves weddings because weddings are fertile ground for chaos, and this one was about to be unforgettable. The ceremony began as expected. The music swelled, the bridesmaids glided down the aisle in their matching pastel dresses, the groomsmen followed looking slightly less graceful, and finally the bride appeared, radiant in white, her veil glowing in the sunlight. People stood, phones came out to capture the moment, and I found myself smiling despite my cynicism. She made it to the altar, took her groom's hands, and the officiant began the speech. Everything was perfectly on track. That's when the geese arrived. At first it was just one, waddling in from the side like it had been invited, honking softly as if to announce its presence. People chuckled, assuming it was harmless, maybe even cute. The bride and groom glanced at each other, shrugged, and tried to focus on the vows. But then more appeared. 2, then 3, then a whole gaggle marching in from the nearby pond like feathered gatecrashers. They honked loudly, flapping their wings, strutting down the aisle as if they were part of the bridal party. The guests laughed nervously, cameras snapping like crazy, but then one particularly bold goose decided to charge the best man. He yelped, stumbled backward, and nearly knocked over the arch. The crowd gasped, the bride squealed. The officiant tried to wave the geese away with his binder, but they weren't having it. The honking grew louder, the flapping more aggressive, and suddenly the wedding was less elegant countryside ceremony and more live-action poultry disaster. Guests scattered from their chairs, some running for safety, others laughing so hard they could barely stand. The bride clutched her groom's arm as if holding on to him could shield her from the chaos. The geese, emboldened, strutted right up to the front row, honking and snapping at bouquets. One goose leapt onto the gift table, knocking over a tower of wrapped presents. Another tried to steal a floral centerpiece, dragging it halfway across the lawn before someone wrestled it back. And then, in what can only be described as cinematic timing, one goose flapped its way onto the buffet table. It landed among the trays of appetizers, honking triumphantly, scattering crackers and cheese cubes everywhere. The chef shouted, waving a ladle, but the goose only dug its beak into the shrimp platter. By this point, the wedding was officially in shambles. The officiant had given up, the groomsmen were trying to herd the geese away, the bridesmaids were shrieking and hiking up their dresses to climb onto chairs, and the photographer was laughing so hard she could barely hold her camera steady. Children were chasing the geese, parents were chasing the children, and somewhere, in the middle of it all, the bride sat down heavily on her chair, face in her hands, muttering something I couldn't hear over the honking. Just when it seemed like things couldn't possibly get worse, they did. Because the geese, apparently bored of appetizers, turned their attention to the wedding cake. A beautiful, 4-tiered masterpiece of white frosting and delicate sugar flowers. The cake stood proudly on its own little table, a centerpiece waiting for its big moment. The geese marched toward it like soldiers. The crowd shouted in unison, but it was too late. One goose launched itself upward, flapping frantically, and crashed into the bottom tier. The cake wobbled dangerously, tilted, and then, in slow motion, collapsed. Frosting and crumbs exploded outward like confetti. The goose stood triumphantly on the wreckage, honking in victory, wings spread as though it had conquered the entire event. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by an eruption of laughter. Even the bride, frosting smeared on her dress from the fallout, started laughing, hysterical, tearful laughter that spread to everyone else. The chaos broke something open in the crowd, turning disaster into comedy. People pulled out their phones, snapping selfies with geese in the background, filming the remains of the cake, shouting commentary like they were sports announcers. The groomsmen finally managed to shoo the geese back toward the pond, though one goose stole a dinner roll and waddled away proudly with it clenched in its beak. Eventually the wedding resumed, albeit in a much more casual state. The officiant skipped half his speech, the couple exchanged vows with frosting still in their hair, and when they kissed, the crowd erupted into cheers that were half joy, half leftover adrenaline from the battle with the birds. Dinner was salvaged, drinks flowed, and by the time the DJ started playing, The disaster had become legend. People danced, laughed, retold the story again and again, embellishing details until it already sounded like folklore. And now, whenever anyone from that wedding gets together, it's never about the vows or the decor or even the love story of the couple. It's about the geese. It's about the moment wildlife stormed the ceremony and left frosting footprints across the buffet table. It's about the way a wedding that should have been ordinary became something nobody could ever forget. And every time I pass a pond and hear geese honking, I can't help but laugh, remembering the weirdest, funniest, and most chaotic wedding I will probably ever attend. A wedding where the guests of honor weren't just the bride and groom, but a flock of uninvited feathered troublemakers who stole the show. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a hotel. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a hotel began on a road trip, when I was too tired to care about anything except finding a bed and a shower. It was late, close to midnight, and I pulled off the highway into one of those towns where everything looks slightly frozen in time, where the neon motel signs still flicker half-lit, and the gas stations feel like they haven't updated their prices since the 90s. I found a mid-range hotel, nothing fancy but not sketchy either, and after checking in, I lugged my bag up to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old carpet, the kind of smell that's both reassuring and slightly unsettling, but I shrugged it off. I opened the door to my room, tossed my bag on the chair, and immediately noticed something odd. The TV was on, not loud, just a soft hum, static filling the screen, grey and white fuzz crackling like an old ghost. I was too tired to care, so I turned it off, showered, and climbed into bed. Just as I was drifting into that half-sleep, the TV clicked back on, static again. I sat up, groaned, and turned it off, muttering about faulty remotes. 10 minutes later, it turned on again. By now, I was too irritated to be scared, so I unplugged it completely, yanked the cord out of the wall, and flopped back onto the bed. That was when I heard it, the faint sound of laughter, not from the hallway, not muffled through the walls, but from inside the room. I froze, heart hammering, straining to hear. The laughter came again, soft and childlike, echoing faintly as though from a corner. I sat up, flicked on the light, and saw nothing. The room was empty, perfectly normal, but the sound lingered in my ears. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was overtired, hallucinating. I climbed back into bed, determined to sleep. At 3 a.m, I woke again to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps across the carpet, but when I sat up, the room was empty. My pulse raced, and I nearly convinced myself to run straight to the lobby in my pajamas, but exhaustion pinned me down. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, pulled the blanket over my head, and forced myself to sleep. When morning came, the room looked ordinary, sunlight streaming through the curtains like nothing had happened. I felt foolish, embarrassed even, as if I'd let my imagination run wild. I packed my things quickly, eager to check out, but curiosity got the better of me. At the front desk, I mentioned the strange TV problem. The clerk gave me a tight smile and said, room 317 again. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I asked. The clerk hesitated, then shrugged. That room, let's just say you're not the first guest to have odd complaints. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Some people say they hear voices. Others swear they see a little boy in the corner. He chuckled softly, but his eyes didn't match the laugh. Of course, it's just old wiring and noisy pipes. Nothing to worry about. I nodded stiffly, thanked him, and hurried out, the bright morning sun feeling almost too bright after the heavy air of that room. For years afterward, I avoided telling the story because it felt too unbelievable, like something out of a bad horror movie. but it's burned into my memory, the static on the TV, the laughter, the footsteps in the dark. And now, every time I check into a hotel, I test the remote, glance into the corners of the room, and listen a little too closely to the silence. Because sometimes the weirdest things don't happen in haunted castles or abandoned houses. Sometimes they happen in the perfectly ordinary hotel room you booked just because you were tired, a room with a number on the door, and a secret that flickers to life at 3 in the morning. The weirdest thing that ever happened on vacation. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on vacation started on what was supposed to be the most relaxing trip of my life, a week away from the stress of work, the noise of the city, and the endless grind of emails that never stop piling up, no matter how many times you clear them. I had booked a small seaside town that promised tranquility, fresh seafood, and the kind of sunsets that make you believe for a moment that life can be perfect. The hotel was charming, the kind of place with white curtains fluttering in the breeze, wicker chairs on the porch, and staff that smiled like they had nothing better to do than make your day pleasant. The first few days were uneventful in the best way possible. I woke to the sound of waves, ate too much at breakfast, wandered through cobblestone streets, bought souvenirs I didn't need, and fell asleep to the lullaby of the ocean. It was the kind of vacation where your biggest problem is deciding whether to nap in a hammock or by the pool. But on the 4th day, everything shifted. That morning, I decided to take a long walk along the beach before the crowds arrived. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the gulls cried overhead, and the horizon stretched endlessly in front of me. About half a mile down the shore, I noticed something odd, a circle of people standing in the sand, silent, facing inward. At first, I thought it was a yoga class, but as I drew closer, I realized no one was moving. They were just standing there, hands at their sides, staring at something in the middle. Curiosity won out, and I walked closer, heart thudding with the strange energy of the scene. In the center of the circle sat a suitcase, just an ordinary black, beat-up suitcase, like the kind you see rolling through airports. But something about the way they stood around it, the reverence in their stillness, made it feel anything but ordinary. I hesitated at the edge of the circle, unsure if I was intruding, but no one acknowledged me. They just stared. Finally, one man stepped forward, bent down, and unzipped the case. Everyone leaned forward. The suitcase opened with a soft hiss, and inside was nothing. Or at least nothing remarkable, just clothes, shirts, pants, socks neatly folded. The group sighed collectively, almost disappointed, and without a word, they turned and walked away, scattering back across the beach like nothing had happened. The suitcase remained. I stood frozen, trying to process what I had just seen. A group of strangers gathered around a suitcase full of laundry, reacting like it was some kind of sacred ritual. I almost laughed, but the eeriness of their silence stuck with me. I approached the suitcase cautiously, half expecting something to leap out, but it was just clothes, faded ordinary clothes that smelled faintly of detergent and salt air. I stepped back, unnerved, and decided to keep walking, trying to shake the strangeness from my head. The rest of the day passed normally enough. I swam, I ate grilled fish at a cafe, I browsed through trinket shops. But the image of that circle lingered, pressing into the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. That night, as I was falling asleep in my hotel room, I heard a knock on the door. 3 sharp knocks. I froze. Slowly I got up, peered through the peephole, and my blood ran cold. Standing in the hallway were 3 of the people I'd seen on the beach. They weren't smiling, they weren't moving. Just standing there, staring at my door. My pulse thundered in my ears. I whispered, "Can I help you?" But they didn't respond. I backed away, heart pounding, waiting. After what felt like hours, They turned in unison and walked away, their footsteps fading down the hall. I barely slept that night. In the morning, the hallway was empty, no sign they had ever been there. I convinced myself it was exhaustion, that maybe I had dreamed it. But when I opened my door to leave for breakfast, there was a small object on the floor in front of me, a sock, faded, ordinary, smelling faintly of detergent and salt air. The rest of the trip blurred after that. I avoided the beach, stuck to tourist areas, kept my eyes on my own business. Nothing else happened directly, but I felt watched, like shadows lingered a beat too long when I turned a corner, like conversations hushed when I entered a room. When my vacation ended, I left that town with relief, eager to return to the safety of routine. But the suitcase haunted me. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream about it, about the circle of silent people, about the sock outside my door. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on vacation wasn't missing luggage or a bad sunburn. It was a suitcase full of clothes and the unsettling sense that I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see, something ordinary made extraordinary by the weight of unspoken ritual, something I will never be able to explain no matter how many times I retell the story. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a work conference. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a work conference happened during what should have been the most boring 3 days of my year. I was sent there by my company because apparently networking opportunities and professional development look good on performance reviews, but in reality, conferences are just long days of sitting in windowless ballrooms, sipping bad coffee and pretending to care about PowerPoint slides filled with bullet points that could have been emailed. The hotel hosting the event was massive, one of those sprawling complexes with identical beige hallways that make you feel like you're walking in circles. I arrived the first morning, badge hanging from my neck, tote bag filled with handouts I'd never read, and prepared myself for boredom. The schedule was packed: keynote speeches, breakout sessions, networking lunches, more sessions, and something optimistically called a team-building activity at night. The keynote was exactly as dull as I expected. A man in a grey suit clicked through slides about synergy and growth metrics, his voice droning like a lullaby for exhausted professionals. People nodded politely, tapped on their phones or scribbled notes that were really just doodles. I was halfway through imagining what would happen if I just walked out and never came back when the strangeness began. The presenter paused, cleared his throat, and clicked to the next slide. Instead of a graph, the projector lit up with a giant photo of a cat wearing sunglasses, lounging on a beach chair with the caption, "Deal with it." The room went silent. Then a ripple of laughter spread. The presenter stammered, clicked again, and another meme appeared. This one was a raccoon holding a knife. He clicked again. Another meme, then another. Someone had hacked the slideshow. The audience erupted into laughter, snapping photos, cheering. The poor man fumbled with his laptop, face bright red, until finally the screen went black. He muttered apologies, promised to get IT, and shuffled off stage. People were buzzing with excitement, and for the first time in years, a keynote was memorable. We thought that would be the end of it, but the chaos had only just begun. During the networking lunch, as we balanced plastic plates of pasta and awkwardly introduced ourselves, the hotel fire alarm went off. A shrill, piercing wail filled the ballroom, and flashing lights blinked overhead. Staff rushed around trying to herd hundreds of confused professionals out the doors and into the parking lot. We stood there in clusters, clutching our name badges, staring at one another in disbelief. After 15 minutes, someone announced it was a false alarm, and we were ushered back in. But something had shifted. The polished facade of the conference was cracking. People were giggling like schoolchildren, whispering theories about pranksters and sabotage. By the second day, the weirdness became impossible to ignore. One breakout session on leadership devolved into chaos when a pigeon somehow flew into the room, circled overhead, and landed on the speaker's podium. Instead of shooing it away, the speaker raised his hands dramatically and declared, "Even nature agrees, leadership takes flight." The crowd roared with laughter, and the pigeon strutted proudly back and forth as though it had been hired for the occasion. Someone fed it crumbs, and it stayed there for the rest of the talk, cooing approvingly whenever the audience clapped. From then on, people referred to that session as the one with the keynote pigeon. Later that afternoon, during a team-building icebreaker, participants were told to share fun facts about themselves. Most people said things like, "I play guitar," or "I once ran a marathon." But one man leaned forward solemnly and said, "I can balance anything on my head." To prove it, he picked up a chair and set it carefully on his skull, standing perfectly still as the entire room gasped. He balanced it for a full minute before casually removing it and saying, "Anyway, that's me." Nobody remembered his actual name, but he became a celebrity for the rest of the conference. Strangers approached him in the hallway asking him to balance random objects. He obliged each time, a coffee cup, a binder, even the conference tote bag, grinning as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. By the final night, the conference had completely unraveled into absurdity. The team-building activity was a trivia game where tables competed for small prizes. But halfway through, the hotel's sound system malfunctioned, and instead of trivia questions, loud karaoke tracks started blasting. A few people hesitated, then shrugged and grabbed the microphone. Before long, the entire ballroom had transformed into a karaoke party, professionals in suits belting out 80s rock ballads while the organizers threw their hands up in defeat. The official trivia was forgotten, and the night ended with a conga line weaving between tables, everyone laughing like they'd forgotten they were supposed to be dignified. When the conference ended the next morning, people were still buzzing, trading stories in the checkout line, swapping numbers not to talk about business, but to share memes and videos of the chaos. On the surface, the conference had been a mess. Slides hacked, alarms blaring, pigeons intruding, karaoke overtaking trivia. But in another way, it had been the most successful one ever, because nobody forgot it. Years later, colleagues still mention the meme keynote or the pigeon session, and laughter ripples through the office. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a work conference wasn't networking, wasn't learning, wasn't professional growth. It was watching order collapse into silliness, watching hundreds of stressed-out adults rediscover how to laugh, and realizing that sometimes the most valuable lesson you can take home isn't on the slides or in the notes. It's that chaos, when embraced, can turn even the dullest conference into the funniest memory of your career. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a family gathering. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a family gathering started out like all the others, with folding chairs dragged out of closets, paper plates stacked high on the kitchen counter, and relatives greeting one another with that combination of forced cheer and mild exhaustion that always hovers in the air when a big group of family comes together. It was summer, hot enough that the air conditioner struggled to keep up, and my aunt's house smelled of barbecue, potato salad, and whatever mysterious casserole my cousin insisted on bringing every year, even though no one ever ate more than a spoonful. The kids were running through the backyard. The adults were huddled in small groups discussing everything from politics to coupons, and the older relatives were already half asleep in armchairs muttering about how loud everyone was. Everything was completely normal until my Uncle Larry arrived. Larry had always been the wild card of the family, the kind of relative who showed up late, left early, and usually brought something strange with him, whether it was a parrot that wouldn't stop swearing, or a new girlfriend half his age who disappeared by the next gathering. This time, however, he walked through the door holding a covered cage, grinning from ear to ear. Everyone groaned. "What is it this time?" my aunt asked, hands on her hips, already regretting letting him in. "You'll see," Larry said with a wink, setting the cage in the middle of the living room and draping a towel over it like he was unveiling a masterpiece. The kids gathered around instantly, bouncing with excitement. The adults exchanged wary glances, bracing for whatever chaos was about to erupt. Finally, with a dramatic flourish, Larry yanked off the towel. Inside the cage was a raccoon, a live raccoon sitting calmly as if it had been waiting for this moment. Gasps filled the room. My grandmother clutched her pearls. Someone dropped a plate. The raccoon blinked at us, nose twitching, and then raised one tiny paw like it was waving. "Larry," my aunt said slowly, "why is there a raccoon in my living room?" "It's not just any raccoon," Larry announced proudly. "This is Ricky. He's tame." As if to prove it, he opened the cage. The adults shouted in protest, but it was too late. Ricky hopped out, landing on the carpet, and immediately waddled over to the snack table. The kids shrieked with joy, clapping and chasing after him, while the adults scrambled to protect the food. Ricky climbed onto the table with surprising grace, grabbed a hot dog bun, and began munching happily. What followed was pure chaos. Every time someone tried to pick him up, Ricky darted away, slipping under chairs, climbing onto couches, knocking over cups of soda. At one point, he ran across my grandfather's lap, leaving mustard paw prints on his shirt. My cousin tried to lure him with chips, only to have Ricky snatch the entire bag and disappear under the couch. The kids thought it was the best day of their lives, cheering and chanting, "Ricky, Ricky," while the adults argued about whether to call animal control. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, Ricky discovered the birthday cake. It was a huge sheet cake decorated with bright frosting flowers, meant to celebrate 3 cousins whose birthdays were close together. Ricky climbed onto the counter, stuck his paws directly into the icing, and began scooping it into his mouth with reckless abandon. The room erupted into shouts and laughter. My aunt nearly fainted, the kids screamed in delight, and Larry stood there beaming like a proud parent. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the chaos slowed. Ricky, bloated from cake and chips, curled up on the couch and fell asleep, frosting smeared across his whiskers. The family gathered around, exhausted, sweaty, and hysterical with laughter. Someone snapped a photo of him sprawled out, like a tiny king, and that photo has been printed, framed, and passed around every holiday since. After that day, Ricky became a legend. The story of the raccoon at the family gathering grew with each retelling. Some claimed he juggled hot dogs, others swore he opened the fridge by himself, and one uncle insisted Ricky whispered secrets to him. The truth hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was that for one summer afternoon, a raccoon turned a routine family gathering into the most unforgettable event we'd ever had. And now, every time we have another get-together, someone inevitably asks, "Remember when Larry brought the raccoon?" And the whole room erupts in laughter, the memory warming us more than the food, more than the drinks, more than the small talk ever could. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a family gathering wasn't a fight, or a drunken argument, or a surprise announcement. It was Ricky the raccoon sitting smugly in the middle of the chaos he created, reminding us that sometimes the best family memories are born from the most unexpected guests. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a grocery store. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a grocery store started out as the most ordinary errand in the world, the kind of errand you do half asleep on a Saturday morning because the fridge is empty, the pantry is sad, and you've run out of excuses to order takeout again. I grabbed a cart, made a list in my head, milk, bread, eggs, cereal, maybe something green to convince myself I was healthy, and rolled into the fluorescent glow of the store. The aisles hummed with the low murmur of shoppers, the squeak of cartwheels, the beeping of scanners at the registers. Everything smelled faintly of bread from the bakery, mixed with that artificial lemon scent from the cleaning aisle. It was in every way as ordinary as it gets, until it wasn't. I was halfway through the produce section, debating whether I really needed kale, when I heard it, a faint clucking. At first I thought it was in my head, some leftover sound effect from a video I'd watched the night before, but then it grew louder. Shoppers around me started glancing around. The clucking echoed off the tiled floor, bouncing between the displays of apples and bananas. Then, out from behind the pyramid of cantaloupes, strutted a live chicken. A full-grown hen, feathers glossy, eyes sharp, clucking proudly, as if she had been waiting for her moment in the spotlight. People froze. A kid pointed and shouted, "Chicken!" And suddenly, the produce section turned into a barnyard. The hen strutted confidently past the carrots, pecked at a stray grape on the floor, and then flapped her wings dramatically, scattering lettuce leaves everywhere. The store employees scrambled. One teenage clerk grabbed a cardboard box, another tried to herd the chicken with a broom, but the bird was faster, darting between carts, slipping under displays, crowing triumphantly each time she escaped. Shoppers abandoned their carts to watch, phones out, recording the chaos. The chicken zigzagged through the bakery aisle, hopped onto a shelf, and sent a stack of hamburger buns tumbling to the ground. The bakery clerk gasped, hands over her mouth, while the chicken tore into a bun with glee. The chase grew. Employees blocked off aisles with carts, forming makeshift barricades, but the chicken always found a gap. At one point she ran straight into the cereal aisle, and in the confusion a man slipped on a box of spilled Cheerios and fell backward into a tower of soda cans. The cans clattered everywhere, rolling under carts, fizzing as they burst open. People cheered like it was a sporting event. The chicken, apparently delighted with the pandemonium, crowed loudly and flapped back into the produce section. I was laughing so hard, tears were running down my face, clutching my cart like it could keep me upright. The hen dashed past me, feathers brushing my leg, and for one insane second I considered trying to grab her, but she was too quick. She darted past the deli counter, leapt onto the rotisserie display, and perched like a queen surveying her kingdom. Shoppers applauded. The deli worker shook his head in defeat. The chicken looked around at her adoring audience, then, with impeccable timing, laid an egg. Right there on the counter. Gasps echoed, then laughter exploded. The hen hopped down, strutted away, leaving the egg like a mic drop. Eventually, animal control arrived, a man in overalls carrying a net, clearly summoned from some back office where he waited for emergencies exactly like this. The crowd parted like he was a gladiator entering the arena. The hen darted left, darted right, but finally the man swooped down with the net and caught her mid-flap. The store erupted into cheers, clapping and whistling like it was the end of a championship game. The man carried the hen out, feathers floating in the air like confetti, and just like that the spell was broken. Employees began cleaning up the wreckage, stacking buns, mopping soda, restocking toppled displays. Shoppers reluctantly returned to their carts, dazed, still laughing, still replaying the madness. I grabbed my groceries quickly, but as I checked out, the cashier leaned forward conspiratorially and whispered, "That's the third time this month." I stared at her, stunned, but she just shrugged like chickens invading the store was as normal as price checks. When I walked out with my bags, the air felt different. The parking lot buzzed with strangers rehashing the story, showing each other videos, laughing like old friends. And ever since, every time I step into a grocery store, I glance down the aisles, half expecting to see feathers, half hoping another chicken will come charging through the frozen food section to remind me that even the most ordinary errands can explode into unforgettable chaos. The the weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a grocery store wasn't a long line or a fight over coupons or a kid throwing a tantrum in the candy aisle. It was a runaway hen named, according to one employee, Gloria, who turned produce into a stage, baked goods into a snack bar, and a room full of weary shoppers into cheering fans at the strangest live performance of my life. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a park. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a park didn't start with anything dramatic. It started with one of those lazy afternoons when you go outside just to escape the four walls of your own house. The air was warm but not stifling, the kind of weather that feels like a soft blanket rather than a heavy coat, and the trees along the path swayed lazily in the breeze. I had decided to take a slow walk, no destination in mind, just the idea of clearing my head. The park itself was one of those places that manages to hold everything at once, kids screaming with joy on the playground swings, joggers huffing past with earbuds firmly in place, elderly couples strolling hand in hand, dogs tugging at leashes, and scattered across the lawn were clusters of families picnicking on blankets. I had bought myself an ice cream from a vendor by the fountain, vanilla with a swirl of caramel, and was happily wandering when I noticed a commotion near the pond. At first it seemed like the usual group of kids throwing bread at the ducks, but then I realized there was a much larger crowd than normal. People were pointing, laughing, pulling out their phones. I followed the sound of the noise, curious, and that's when I saw him, a man in a full black tuxedo, bow tie perfectly in place, standing waist-deep in the pond. He wasn't struggling or embarrassed. He wasn't shouting for help. He was holding a violin, chin resting on the instrument, bow gliding across strings, filling the air with music. Not just random notes either. Beautiful, deliberate, haunting music that echoed across the water. The ducks flapped around him in confusion, but also seemed, oddly, mesmerized, circling as if they were his orchestra. The crowd was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause, but the man didn't acknowledge anyone. He played with the focus of someone lost in his own world. I sat down on a bench, completely transfixed, ice cream dripping onto my hand unnoticed. The man played as though the pond was his stage, as though algae on his trousers and ducks pecking at his shoes were simply part of the composition. Just when I thought I had processed the strangeness of the scene, it escalated. A group of joggers stopped nearby, whispering and laughing. Without warning, one of them, a tall guy with wild hair, kicked off his shoes, ran straight into the pond, and began dancing around the violinist. Not just any dancing either, but a kind of wild interpretive ballet, spinning and leaping and splashing like he was auditioning for Swan Lake. The crowd roared with laughter, cheering and clapping in rhythm with the music. The violinist didn't flinch. He simply played louder, his bow moving furiously as the dancer twirled through the water, sending waves splashing into the crowd at the pond's edge. Children squealed with delight, their parents too stunned to pull them back. Then more people joined in. A group of kids ran into the water, splashing in circles, laughing so hard they nearly toppled over. Someone on the shore began singing along tunelessly to the melody, inventing words about ducks and sunshine. Another man tossed bread into the pond like confetti. What began as one man playing violin had turned into a full-blown spectacle, half concert, half comedy show. Strangers were hugging each other, holding up their phones to record, united in the sheer absurd joy of it all. Of course, not everyone was amused. The park ranger appeared, whistle blowing, stomping toward the chaos with the face of someone whose shift had suddenly gotten far more complicated. He shouted for everyone to get out of the water, but the crowd drowned him out with cheers. The violinist played a final flourish, dragging out the last note so long it seemed to hang in the air. The dancer bowed deeply, water dripping from his hair, before sprinting away into the trees like some mythical woodland creature. The violinist tucked his instrument under his arm, climbed calmly out of the pond, and walked away, shoes squelching, leaving behind only ripples in the water and a stunned silence. The ranger muttered angrily as he herded the kids out of the pond, scolding parents who were too busy laughing to care. The ducks, reclaiming their territory, quacked indignantly as if annoyed their concert had ended. Slowly, the crowd dispersed, still buzzing, still laughing, showing each other the videos they had captured. I sat on the bench, finally licking the ice cream that had nearly melted down my wrist, trying to process what I had just witnessed. It felt like I had stumbled into a dream, the kind of dream you try to describe the next morning only for people to look at you skeptically. That night, I checked social media, and sure enough, clips of the performance were already spreading. People were calling it the Duck Pond Symphony, sharing shaky videos of the tuxedoed violinist and the manic dancer, debating whether it was performance art, a prank, or madness. Some insisted it had to be a planned stunt. Others argued it was too random to be anything but genuine chaos. No one seemed to know who the violinist was, and the dancer disappeared into legend. But for me, the weirdest thing about that afternoon wasn't just the music or the dancing or the ducks. It was the way the ordinary park transformed in an instant. A place where people came to jog, to picnic, to play, suddenly became a stage where strangers laughed together, bonded by something so ridiculous and so beautiful that we forgot ourselves for a while. And now, every time I pass that park, I glance at the pond, half expecting to see a man in a tuxedo standing waist-deep in the water, violin in hand, waiting to play for his feathered audience again. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a park wasn't a squirrel stealing a sandwich or a kite getting stuck in a tree. It was music rising from the middle of a pond, a dancer splashing like a swan, and a crowd of strangers becoming an audience to the strangest, most unforgettable concert of my life. The weirdest thing that ever happened on a road trip. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on a road trip began the way most road trips begin, with optimism, snacks, and the false belief that everything will go smoothly. My two friends and I had planned it for months, a long weekend of driving up the coast, windows down, music blasting, and the promise of adventure. The car was loaded with backpacks, coolers, and way too many bags of chips. We had a carefully curated playlist, a vague idea of our stops, and the shared excitement of escaping normal life for a few days. The first few hours were exactly what you'd expect, laughing, singing, arguing about whether we should take scenic routes or stick to the highway. The air smelled of salt as we got closer to the ocean, and the road stretched out ahead of us like it could take us anywhere. Nothing seemed unusual at all until we saw him. It was mid-afternoon, sun slanting low, when we came around a bend and spotted a man walking along the shoulder of the road. At first, nothing about him stood out, but as we got closer, we realized he was wearing a full suit of armor, not a costume, not cheap plastic, but real, gleaming metal armor that clanked as he walked. He carried a helmet under one arm, a grocery bag in the other, and looked completely unfazed by the cars honking and slowing down to stare. We drove past in stunned silence before immediately pulling off at the next turnout, whipping our heads around to confirm we hadn't hallucinated it. He was still there, trudging steadily along the shoulder like a medieval knight out for an afternoon stroll. We argued about what to do. One friend wanted to keep going, chalk it up to weird roadside theatre. Another insisted we had to turn back and ask him what was happening. Curiosity won, as it always does on road trips. We looped around, slowed down beside him, rolled down the window and asked if he needed a ride. Without hesitation he said, "Yes, thank you," as though nothing about the situation was unusual. We shoved bags aside, he climbed into the back seat, armor clanking, and introduced himself simply as Gerald. We tried not to laugh as the car sagged under the weight of steel, but Gerald was perfectly polite, thanking us for the lift and explaining in a calm voice that he was on his way to a gathering. He didn't elaborate. For the next hour we drove in stunned amusement as Gerald told us little bits about his life, most of which only raised more questions. He spoke about jousting practice, about how the armor was authentic but slightly modified for comfort, about how modern life could learn a lot from chivalric codes. He munched calmly on trail mix, passing the bag around like this was a perfectly normal carpool. We asked where exactly he wanted to be dropped off, and he directed us to a small town up ahead. The whole drive, other cars passed us, drivers craning their necks to stare at the knight riding shotgun in a beat-up Honda. Kids in passing minivans pointed and screamed with joy. One man nearly ran off the road while trying to take a photo. When we pulled into the town, Gerald instructed us to stop near a park. We expected maybe a reenactment fair, a Renaissance festival, some explanation that would tie everything together. What we got was stranger. The park was empty, just grass, trees, and a picnic table. Gerald thanked us, climbed out, and walked steadily toward the middle of the field. There he placed his helmet on his head, drew a wooden sword from the grocery bag, and began practicing slow, deliberate swings. We sat in the car, staring. 10 minutes passed 20. A few locals walked by, barely glancing at him, as though the sight of a knight training in the park was completely normal. Finally, we had to leave. Gerald waved once, sword raised in salute, and we drove away, still laughing, still unable to make sense of it. The rest of the road trip was wonderful, but no stop, no view, no meal ever topped the sheer absurdity of giving a ride to a night on the highway. We told the story at every diner we stopped at, reenacted the clanking sound every time someone shifted in their seat, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. Years later, it's still the first thing anyone mentions when that trip comes up. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on a road trip wasn't a flat tire, wasn't getting lost, wasn't running out of gas. It was the knight named Gerald who hitched a ride with 3 bewildered strangers and turned an ordinary drive into a story none of us will ever forget. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a concert. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a concert began on a night that was already perfect, the kind of night that hums with anticipation before anything has even started. I had tickets to see one of my favorite bands, a group I'd been listening to since high school, and the venue was buzzing with that electric energy that only live music can bring. People were lined up outside in their band shirts, chatting excitedly. Scalpers were calling out for last-minute buyers, and the smell of food trucks hung heavy in the air. When we finally shuffled inside, the lights were dim, the stage was set with instruments gleaming under spotlights, and the crowd was vibrating with the collective thrill of thousands of strangers brought together for one reason: music. The show began as expected, loud and euphoric, the band hitting every note perfectly, the crowd surging forward in waves, hands raised, voices screaming lyrics into the dark. I was swept up in it, jumping with the crowd, laughing with strangers who felt like best friends for the night. And then, in the middle of the third song, something unusual happened. At first, it was just a shadow above the stage, something moving near the rafters. The band kept playing, the lights flashing, but the movement grew more obvious. Suddenly, with perfect dramatic timing, a man dressed head to toe in a banana costume rappelled down from the ceiling on a rope, landing squarely in the middle of the stage. The band froze mid-song. The crowd gasped, then erupted into laughter and cheers. The banana man stood tall, arms raised in triumph, and began to dance. Not just any dance, but an elaborate, choreographed routine, spinning, flipping, thrusting his hips in perfect rhythm with the music. The lead singer glanced at his bandmates, shrugged, and then, because live shows thrive on chaos, kept singing. The band launched back into the song, and the banana man became part of the performance. The crowd went insane. Phones shot into the air, people screamed, security guards rushed forward but were waved back by the guitarist, who seemed to be enjoying the absurdity too much to stop it. The banana man danced through the entire song, somehow hitting every beat, every lyric, as though he had rehearsed it for weeks. At one point, he grabbed a tambourine off the stage and shook it with such intensity the drummer nearly fell off his stool laughing. The audience chanted, "Banana, banana," drowning out the actual lyrics. When the song ended, the banana man struck a dramatic pose, bowed deeply, and sprinted off stage, disappearing into the wings. Everyone assumed that was it, just a bizarre interruption, but the weirdness wasn't over. Half an hour later, during one of the band's biggest hits, he returned, this time carrying an inflatable pool float shaped like a unicorn. Without hesitation, he launched himself into the crowd, climbed onto the float, and began crowd surfing across the sea of hands like a king riding his bizarre steed. The band played harder, the lights flashed brighter, and the audience lost its collective mind. I was close enough to actually help push the unicorn along, feeling the weight of the banana man above me, his costume squeaking against the plastic float as he waved to his adoring subjects. It was the kind of surreal moment you couldn't invent if you tried. By the time security finally caught him near the back of the venue, the crowd was chanting his name so loudly it drowned out the song. The band, laughing too hard to keep playing, cut the music and applauded him themselves. The banana man bowed again as security dragged him toward the exit, still pumping his fists in victory. And just when we thought we'd seen the last of him, during the encore, he somehow reappeared. This time in the balcony, spotlight catching him mid-dance as he shook his hips wildly. The entire crowd turned, cheering louder for him than for the band itself. The lead singer threw up his hands in mock defeat and shouted into the microphone, "Give it up for Banana Man!" And the place erupted. To this day, I don't know how he pulled it off. How did he get past security 3 separate times? How did he rappel from the ceiling in a banana suit without anyone stopping him? Was he part of the show all along, or just a master prankster who turned chaos into legend? No one ever found out. What I do know is that every time that band tours now, fans show up in banana costumes, hoping to carry on his legacy. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a concert wasn't the music itself, though the music was great. It was the night a banana stole the spotlight, turned a concert into a circus, and reminded us all that sometimes the best part of a show is the part that nobody planned. The weirdest thing that ever happened at school. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at school didn't take place during a field trip or a sports event, or even one of those fire drills where everyone stands in the parking lot pretending they aren't freezing. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in the middle of the semester when we were all half asleep, the teachers were just trying to make it to lunch, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like they too were tired of the routine. The day began as unremarkably as any other. Students slouched at desks, notebooks open but mostly blank, pencils tapping, the faint smell of cafeteria pizza drifting through the halls. In my classroom, the math teacher was droning about equations, and I was fighting the urge to rest my head on the desk when the loudspeaker crackled. Everyone groaned, expecting the usual announcement about lost property or the reminder not to chew gum. But instead of the principal's voice, we heard music. Not the kind of music they played at assemblies, not the national anthem, but loud, triumphant circus music. The entire class froze. The teacher frowned at the ceiling. The music blared for a full 30 seconds before cutting off, followed by the unmistakable honk of a clown horn. Then silence. The teacher stammered something about a technical glitch, tried to resume the lesson, but everyone was buzzing with confusion. 10 minutes later, the door to the classroom burst open and in marched a full marching band. Not our school band, but a random group of musicians we'd never seen before, dressed in mismatched uniforms, playing as loudly as possible. Trumpets blared, drums pounded, and a man in a glittery top hat conducted them with wild enthusiasm. They paraded right through the classroom, weaving between desks, students shouting in disbelief, papers flying off tables from the sheer volume of the drums. The teacher shouted for order, but no one could hear her over the chaos. Then, as quickly as they appeared, the band marched back out into the hallway, still playing, the sound fading until it disappeared. The room was left in stunned silence. Then everyone erupted into laughter, disbelief, questions flying. The teacher gave up entirely, collapsing into her chair with her head in her hands. Before we could even process what had just happened, the loudspeaker crackled again. A voice, not the principal, not anyone we recognized, boomed, "Attention, students, the treasure hunt begins now." Gasps and giggles filled the room. Teachers tried to calm us down, but it was useless. Moments later, students in the hallways were running, shouting about envelopes taped under desks, about riddles written on scraps of paper. The entire school turned into chaos. Sure enough, taped to the underside of my desk was an envelope. Inside was a riddle about where knowledge meets nourishment. My friends and I sprinted to the library where we found another clue hidden inside a book. Each clue led to another, taking us through classrooms, into the gym, even out to the football field. Teachers tried to stop us, but many gave up, some even laughing as they realized they had lost control. The entire school had been transformed into a giant scavenger hunt. Hours passed, like minutes. Clues grew stranger, more elaborate, leading us through secret corners of the building we'd never noticed before. At one point, we had to follow a trail of rubber ducks that ended at the janitor's closet, where a man in a gorilla costume handed us the next clue with complete seriousness. The finale came when the last clue led everyone to the cafeteria. There, waiting on the stage, was the principal, wearing a pirate hat, holding a plastic sword, and standing beside a chest filled with candy. The crowd of students cheered like we had just won a championship. The principal grinned sheepishly and admitted that the whole thing had been planned as a morale booster experiment. Apparently, the school board had approved it, though no one had bothered to tell the teachers. The day ended in chaos but also joy. Homework was forgotten, tests were postponed, and students left buzzing with laughter and stories. Videos of the band, the riddles, the gorilla, and the candy chest spread through the community for weeks. And now, years later, whenever people from my school get together, we never talk about exams or grades or assignments. We talk about the day the school turned into a circus, the day learning stopped and madness reigned, the day we realized that even the most ordinary places can explode into unforgettable weirdness when you least expect it. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at school wasn't a prank gone wrong or a fire drill in the rain. It was the day the marching band and the gorilla showed up to remind us that sometimes chaos is the best teacher of all. The weirdest thing that ever happened on a flight. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on a flight began like any other trip, with the shuffle of people queuing at the gate, the impatient sighs of frequent flyers, the sound of zippers as bags were stuffed into overhead compartments, and the resigned look on the faces of the crew who knew they were about to babysit 200 strangers in a metal tube hurtling through the sky. I had a window seat, row 18, and I settled in with a neck pillow, headphones, and the naive hope that maybe, just maybe, the flight would be uneventful. The plane rumbled down the runway, engines roared, and we lifted into the clouds. Everything was routine until it wasn't. About an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign was off, and the flight attendants had begun pushing carts down the aisle. I was half asleep, gazing out at the endless white clouds when I heard laughter, not the normal polite chuckle of someone watching a sitcom on their tablet, but full-on belly laughter, loud enough to carry through several rows. I turned to see a man in the middle of the plane standing up, arms spread wide, declaring loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves for magic." Before anyone could react, he pulled a deck of cards from his pocket and began performing tricks. At first it was small things, pulling a card from behind someone's ear, making one vanish into thin air. But soon he had half the cabin's attention. The flight attendants looked exasperated but didn't stop him, probably because the passengers were laughing instead of complaining. Then he took it up a notch. He reached into the overhead compartment, pulled out a rubber chicken, yes, a rubber chicken, and began juggling it along with 2 oranges he'd borrowed from someone's snack bag. The entire section of the plane erupted into applause. Even the flight attendant hiding a smile near the galley couldn't help but clap. The magician bowed, basking in the absurdity of it all, then announced, "For my final trick, I will need a volunteer." A little girl raised her hand eagerly, and he called her forward. He whispered something in her ear, handed her the deck of cards, and told her to choose one. She pulled out a card, showed it to everyone. It was the Queen of Hearts, and slipped it back into the deck. He shuffled theatrically, tossed the cards into the air, and with one smooth motion pulled the Queen of Hearts from his shoe. The cabin erupted in cheers. People clapped, whistled, shouted. Even the captain made an announcement over the intercom. "Whoever's doing magic in row 20, please keep it up. Morale is at an all-time high." But the weirdness didn't end there. As the magician basked in his applause, the lights flickered. The plane jolted slightly, nothing serious, but enough to make everyone tense. And then, from the back of the cabin, a voice called out, "I can do better!" A second man stood up, this one dressed like a cowboy, complete with boots, hat, and a belt buckle the size of a dinner plate. He pulled out a harmonica and began to play, a mournful tune that somehow cut perfectly through the noise. The caring magician, not to be outdone, started juggling again. The cowboy kept playing. Soon, half the plane was clapping along to the beat, and the magician was juggling faster, sweat shining on his forehead, the cowboy's harmonica wailing like a train in the night. People leaned into the aisles, cheering them on, turning the flight into a bizarre talent show at 30,000 feet. The flight attendants, realizing they had completely lost control, gave up and started passing out extra snacks just to keep the crowd happy. A woman near the front unwrapped a bag of cookies and began tossing them back like prizes at a carnival. Someone in row 12 stood up and began tap dancing in the aisle. It was madness. The plane had turned into a circus. And yet, instead of fear or frustration, everyone was grinning, laughing, living in the strange joy of it. Eventually, the cowboy collapsed into his seat, exhausted, and the magician took a bow so deep he nearly toppled over. The cabin returned to something like normalcy, though the energy was still buzzing. When the captain finally announced our descent, the whole plane groaned with disappointment, as though we'd just been told recess was over. As we landed and taxied to the gate, the magician stood up one last time, held the Queen of Hearts high above his head, and shouted, "Don't forget the magic!" People cheered, clapping as if we'd just witnessed a Broadway show. I walked off the plane dazed, still laughing, wondering how on earth I was supposed to explain this to anyone. And yet, when I got to baggage claim, strangers from the flight were still smiling at each other, shaking their heads in disbelief, bonded forever by the strangest in-flight entertainment we would ever experience. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on a flight wasn't turbulence or lost luggage. It was the magician, the cowboy, the tap dancer, and the way 200 strangers became an audience to the most unexpected performance in the sky. The weirdest thing that ever happened at the gym. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at the gym began on one of those days where I was already regretting leaving the house. I had promised myself I would stick to a new routine, wake up early, and actually use the membership I'd been paying for month after month. But when I walked into the gym that morning, it felt like the universe had other plans. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and sweat, the pop playlist was thumping through the speakers, and the usual cast of characters were in place. The guy grunting dramatically on the bench press, the woman running effortlessly on the treadmill like she was auditioning for a commercial, the cluster of people hogging the free weights while chatting more than lifting. I found a treadmill, plugged in my headphones, and prepared to trudge through 30 minutes of convincing myself I was having fun. For the first 10 minutes, everything was completely normal, and then from the corner of my eye I saw movement that didn't fit. At first, I thought maybe someone had brought in a personal trainer with a flair for theatrics, but no, it was a man, fully dressed in a superhero costume, not workout gear with a cape, not themed leggings, but a full spandex suit, mask, gloves and boots. He marched confidently through the gym, striking poses as if cameras were flashing, and then headed straight for the squat rack. Everyone froze, staring in disbelief. The front desk staff looked at each other but didn't intervene, maybe too stunned to act. The superhero, unfazed by the silence, loaded weights onto the bar, struck another pose, and began squatting with perfect form. Each rep was punctuated by a dramatic, "For justice!" shouted at top volume. The gym erupted into laughter. Some people pulled out their phones, recording, while others cheered him on. He finished his set, racked the bar with a flourish, and moved to the pull-up bar. He leapt up, grabbed the bar, and began doing rapid pull-ups while narrating loudly about the importance of strength in defeating villains. A group of teenagers clapped and counted his reps like he was performing on stage. Sweat dripped down his mask, but he didn't break character. He launched into push-ups, burpees, lunges, each exercise more exaggerated than the last, punctuated with superhero catchphrases. But the real chaos began when he spotted the treadmill. He jumped on, cranked the speed to maximum, and shouted, "I must run to save the city!" The belt whirred, his legs blurred, and the entire gym crowded around to watch. For a moment, it was impressive. Then inevitably disaster struck. His foot slipped, the treadmill flung him backward, and he went flying into the wall with a dramatic thud. Gasps filled the room, followed by silence. He lay there for a beat, sprawled in his cape, then slowly stood, raised a fist, and declared, "Evil will not prevail." The gym erupted into applause. Staff rushed over, offering to help, but he waved them off, striding to the center of the gym where he delivered an impromptu speech about the power of resilience. He bowed deeply, cape fluttering, and without another word, marched out the door into the sunlight, leaving the entire gym in stunned, hysterical disbelief. For the rest of my workout, people couldn't stop talking about it. Strangers were laughing together, replaying the fall, quoting his catchphrases. The front desk admitted they had no idea who he was. He wasn't a member, hadn't signed in, just appeared in full costume and vanished just as quickly. Later that night, videos flooded social media. Superhero Gym Guy became a brief, viral sensation, clips of his treadmill disaster and triumphant speech spreading far beyond our little town. Nobody ever figured out who he was or why he chose that gym. Some said it was a publicity stunt, others swore it was performance art. But to me it didn't matter. What mattered was the way one bizarre morning turned an ordinary workout into the funniest, most unforgettable gym session of my life. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at the gym wasn't breaking a personal record or spotting a celebrity. It was watching a masked hero fight imaginary villains with squats and pull-ups, fall flat on his face, and still manage to walk away as the undisputed champion of the day. The weirdest thing that ever happened on a date. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on a date started out like the kind of story you think will be boring. The kind of story that begins with the usual nerves of choosing what to wear, rehearsing conversation topics in your head, and checking your reflection 100 times before leaving the house. I had met this person through a friend, and we had exchanged a few messages that felt promising. So when we agreed to meet at a little Italian restaurant downtown, I thought it would be an ordinary evening. Good food, casual conversation, and maybe a spark if the universe was kind. I arrived first, sat at a small table near the window, ordered water, and tried to look casual instead of like someone frantically refreshing the clock on their phone. When they walked in, they were smiling, confident, and immediately put me at ease. We ordered pasta, settled into conversation, and for the first half hour everything was smooth, even fun. We laughed about awkward first dates, swapped favorite books, and I began to think maybe this could be something. Then the strangeness began. It started small when my date excused themselves to the restroom. A few minutes passed, then more, and just as I began to wonder if they'd bailed, they returned, wearing a completely different outfit. Not drastically different, but instead of the casual shirt and jeans they'd walked in with, they now wore a crisp button-up and slacks as though they had stepped into a wardrobe change mid-show. I blinked, unsure if I was losing my mind, but they sat down casually, smiled, and picked up the conversation as if nothing had happened. I decided not to mention it, assuming maybe I had misremembered. We kept talking, the food arrived, and the evening went on, but 20 minutes later it happened again. Another restroom break, another outfit. This time a bright red sweater with matching shoes. I stared in disbelief as they twirled a strand of pasta around their fork, like nothing was unusual. By now I couldn't hold it in. "Did you just change clothes?" I asked, trying to sound casual. They smiled, shrugged, and said, "I like to keep things fresh." I laughed nervously, unsure if this was some elaborate prank. But as the evening stretched on, the changes continued. Every time they left the table, they came back in something new, a jacket with sequins, a t-shirt with a cartoon cat, even a full tracksuit at one point. The waitstaff were whispering, amused, and other diners were openly staring, nudging one another as though they had stumbled into a reality show. I couldn't stop laughing, partly from nerves, partly from the absurdity of it. The final straw came during dessert. They excused themselves once more, and when they returned, they were dressed in a tuxedo. A full tuxedo, complete with bow tie and shiny shoes. They sat down, folded their napkin neatly, and said, "I thought I'd dress up for dessert." The entire restaurant erupted into laughter. Even the waiter clapped. At that moment, any pretense of normal dating had evaporated. I was crying with laughter, unable to eat my tiramisu. My date remained perfectly composed, sipping their espresso like this was the most natural thing in the world. When the bill came, they insisted on paying, pulling out their wallet with a flourish, bowing slightly like a magician finishing a trick. As we walked outside, the cool night air hit me, and I realized I had no idea what to make of the evening. It hadn't been romantic, not in the traditional sense, but it had been unforgettable. We hugged goodbye, and as they walked away, they peeled off their jacket and revealed yet another outfit underneath, a neon green hoodie glowing under the streetlights. I never went on a second date with them. Not because I didn't enjoy myself, but because I had no idea how to top that first one. How do you follow an evening where your date changes outfit 6 times in 2 hours? But to this day, whenever someone asks me about the strangest date I've ever had, I tell the story of the outfit changer, the human chameleon who turned dinner into a runway show and left me laughing so hard my stomach hurt. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on a date wasn't bad food, awkward silences, or an argument about the bill. It was a series of wardrobe changes that turned a simple dinner into one of the funniest, most surreal nights of my life. The weirdest thing that ever happened at a festival. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a festival began the moment I stepped off the shuttle bus and heard the distant hum of music carried through the air like thunder on the horizon. Festivals are always a little chaotic, full of people in glitter and neon, food trucks pumping out smells of fried everything, and the steady thump of bass from stages that seem to multiply the further you walk. This one was no different, or so I thought. The sun was high, the sky blazing blue, and everyone around me seemed to have that wild, buzzing energy that only comes when thousands of people gather for the sole purpose of celebrating nothing in particular. I grabbed a lemonade, found my friends near the main stage, and prepared myself for a weekend of music, dancing, and overpriced snacks. But within an hour, the weirdness began. The first strange thing was the parade. Not the official parade the schedule had promised with floats and costumes, but a completely unofficial procession that materialized out of nowhere. It began with a man on stilts, wobbling gracefully through the crowd in a three-piece suit and top hat, towering above everyone else like a Victorian giant. People stopped and stared, clapping as he passed, but then more followed. Women in full ball gowns covered in sequins, a guy dressed as a giant lobster, and someone pushing a shopping cart filled with rubber ducks. None of it was announced, none of it was explained, and yet hundreds of festival goers fell in line, marching through the grounds as though they had been planning it all along. My friends and I were swept into the current, laughing as we followed the absurd parade past the food stalls and through the stages. It ended as abruptly as it had begun, dispersing into the crowd like a dream. Later that afternoon, as a band played their set under a blazing sun, a man climbed a tree near the stage. Nobody noticed at first, but slowly people began pointing, whispering. He kept climbing, higher and higher, until he was perched at the very top, swaying dangerously as the branches bent under his weight. Security rushed forward, trying to coax him down, but instead he pulled a kazoo out of his pocket and began playing along with the music. The crowd erupted into cheers, chanting, "Kazoo, kazoo!" The band noticed, paused mid-song, and then, to everyone's delight, adjusted their playing to match his off-key squeals. For 10 glorious minutes, the festival became a collaboration between a professional band and a random kazoo player in a tree. Eventually, he climbed down safely, high-fiving security guards as though he were part of the act all along. But the weirdest moment came after dark. The air had cooled, lights glowed from every corner, and the crowd was buzzing with energy as the headliner took the stage. Thousands of people danced, shouted lyrics, waved their arms, when suddenly the music cut out. The lights dimmed. For a moment, silence. People murmured in confusion. Then, from the middle of the crowd, a spotlight hit. Standing there, illuminated and perfectly calm, was a man in a banana costume. Not just a cheap costume either. This was elaborate, padded and glossy, the Cadillac of fruit suits. He raised a hand, the crowd cheered, and without warning he began conducting us like an orchestra. He gestured for us to clap, and we clapped in rhythm. He signaled for us to chant, and we chanted nonsense syllables that somehow blended into a beat. The entire field of thousands became his choir, following his every move. Just when it felt like the moment couldn't get stranger, the music returned. The band picked up right where we left off, seamlessly blending their instruments with the rhythm the Banana Man had created. The crowd roared in ecstasy, leaping into the air, the banana conducting wildly from the center of it all. For the rest of the set, he stayed there, bouncing and dancing, the unofficial mascot of the night. Security never touched him, the band never acknowledged him, and yet everyone knew he had changed the entire energy of the show. By the time the festival ended, people weren't talking about the official acts or the food or the merch. They were talking about the parade of ducks, the kazoo in the tree, and the banana who conducted thousands like some surreal maestro. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me at a festival wasn't losing my friends in the crowd, wasn't waiting an hour for fries, wasn't even seeing someone pass out in the sun. It was the way chaos and absurdity took over, unplanned, unstoppable, unforgettable. And now whenever I hear music blasting in a field, I half expect to see a banana rise from the crowd and take control once more. The weirdest thing that ever happened on public transport. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on public transport started on a Tuesday morning commute, the kind of morning where everyone looks half asleep, headphones in, coffee cups clutched like lifelines, and the bus or train feels less like transportation and more like a mobile waiting room. I had wedged myself into a seat by the window, scrolling idly on my phone, resigned to the usual half hour of boredom. The air smelled faintly of wet jackets and engine oil, the usual mixture of tired silence and the occasional cough filling the space. Everything seemed perfectly normal, and that was why what happened next was so bizarre. It began when a man climbed aboard carrying a giant cardboard box. People bring boxes onto buses sometimes, nothing strange about that. But this box was large, taped haphazardly, bulging at the sides like it was struggling to contain something inside. He set it carefully on the seat next to him, patting it as though it were alive. I might not have thought much of it, but the box moved. At first, just a little wiggle, subtle enough to question whether I'd imagined it. Then more distinctly a lurch that made the tape stretch and the sides bulge. A ripple of whispers spread down the bus as people began to notice. The man whispered to the box, "Easy now, Henry," stroking it as though soothing a pet. Everyone stared. The tape peeled back with a soft rip. The flap popped open, and out shot a rooster, a full-grown rooster, feathers glossy, wings flapping, squawking so loudly it rattled the windows. The bus exploded into chaos. Passengers screamed, scrambled onto seats, clutched their bags to their chests. The rooster strutted down the aisle like a king, crowing triumphantly, chest puffed out. The man leapt up, shouting, "Henry, come back!" But Henry had no intention of cooperating. He darted under seats, pecked at shoelaces, flapped onto laps. A woman shrieked as he scattered her bag of groceries. An old man muttered, "Of course," and folded his newspaper, as though this were just another Tuesday. The driver slammed the brakes, pulled over, and shouted, "What's going on back there?" as though the deafening squawks didn't answer the question. At that moment, Henry flapped onto the driver's dashboard, perched by the steering wheel, and let out the loudest crow I've ever heard. The driver swore, tried to shoo him away with his hat, but Henry stood his ground, wings outstretched, victorious. The entire bus dissolved into laughter and chaos. Phones came out, people recording, narrating breathlessly for their friends. A child clapped and shouted, "Chicken! Chicken!" delighted. The man pleaded, climbing over seats in pursuit, but Henry dodged every attempt, feathers raining down like confetti. Finally, after what felt like forever, the man managed to grab Henry mid-flap. The rooster squawked indignantly, wings beating furiously, but the man held on, murmuring soothing words like, "It's okay, buddy, it's okay," as if that would calm a furious bird. He shoved Henry back into the box, retaped it quickly, and sat down panting, eyes darting nervously around at the glares and laughter of fellow passengers. The driver shook his head, muttering about no livestock on the bus, but started driving again anyway, as if nothing had happened. Slowly, everyone returned to their seats, still buzzing, still replaying the madness. Strangers who had never spoken to each other before were laughing together, bonded forever by the absurdity of a rooster's rampage. When I finally stepped off at my stop, I walked away, still hearing Henry's triumphant crow echoing in my head. And the thing is, whenever people swap stories about weird things on buses or trains, delays, loud phone calls, broken air conditioning, I always win. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, tops the day a rooster named Henry declared dominion over a city bus, turned a dreary Tuesday into a circus, and reminded us all that sometimes the strangest, funniest, most unforgettable moments happen when you're just trying to get from point A to point B.